Rachel Jane Nickell was born on November 23, 1968, in a village near Colchester, England. She grew up in a decent, full family. Her father was an army officer and her mother a housewife. From an early age, the young woman took part in various volunteer programs, helping the elderly and children with disabilities. At age 11, she enrolled at Colchester High School for Girls, where she was active in dance, singing, and acting. All of her teachers insisted that the young woman had real talent and should develop in that direction. However, Rachel herself was more deeply into the study of history and English. After school, she got a job as a lifeguard at the pool in Richmond. Rachel later planned to try her hand at hosting a television program for children. In 1988, when she was 20 years old, Rachel met her future husband, Andre. The couple began dating, and a year later they had a son, Alex. Together they moved to an area of London called Thelham. By then, she had already been offered a job as a model, but she decided to devote her full attention to her family for a few years and then try to get a job in television. On a summer morning, July 15, 1992, Rachel took her son and their Labrador for a walk in the local park. At the time, Alex was only a month away from his 3rd birthday. This park in Wimbledon Common neighborhood was popular with the locals. There were always a lot of people there during the daytime, mostly parents with children and dog walkers. Despite this, because of the large area and the abundance of greenery, it was always possible to get away from prying eyes and enjoy nature in solitude. Unfortunately, there was a downside to this. At about 10:30 a.m., a woman walking in the park noticed a gruesome scene. A young woman was lying on the ground. There was a lot of blood around, and a small child was sitting next to her. The victim was Rachel. Several dozen police officers arrived on the scene. They had to cordon off an area of 4 square kilometers where there were hundreds of potential witnesses and possibly the killer. Detectives soon realized that none of the park's visitors had seen either the moment of the attack or the killer himself. No one, except for one witness, Rachel's son, Alex. They were to get all the information from the 2-year-old boy. Of course, this was extremely difficult to do. The child was first admitted to the hospital for examination to make sure he was not injured. Later, the detectives did get some information from him. He said he and his mother were approached by a tall, thin, white man with brown hair. Everyone in that park was questioned. It took the police almost an entire day, but it only took a few hours for reporters to get the whole country to hear about this gruesome crime. Rachel's case instantly caused a wide resonance, which is not surprising. A young mother died in front of her child in one of the most popular parks in London. Residents of Britain were even more shocked when the newspapers leaked information from the pathologist's report. Rachel had been stabbed 49 times with a sharp object. There was enormous pressure on the Metropolitan Police. Society demanded that the sadist be caught and punished as quickly as possible, and detectives did indeed have to work at an accelerated pace. In the first few weeks, they interviewed 548 men, 32 of whom were even arrested for a short period of time, but all to no avail. The police simply had no leads. The only thing the experts were able to find was a tiny piece of organic material that they thought might be connected to the killer, but 1992 technology simply didn't allow them to study it. By September, investigators were left with no suspects, so they enlisted the help of Paul Britton, a renowned profiler, to compile a description of the killer. Here's what he came up with. He is a man in his late 20s to early 30s, most likely living alone. All of his hobbies are also socially unrelated. He's interested in knives and the occult and has sadistic fantasies. In addition, he lives near the park. At the request of the police department, this profile, along with the sketch, was shown on television. After that, they received at least 4 calls, all with the same matching name, Colin Francis Stagg. In addition to the fact that he fit the sketch, the police ran his name and realized that he had already been on their radar. The fact is that Stagg had tried to enter the park the day Rachel was killed. Colin Stagg, 27, had led a secluded lifestyle. He had lost his job and was struggling to find money to pay for housing and food. He had a dog that he walked every morning in Wimbledon Common Park. According to his testimony, on the day Rachel was killed, he went there with his dog, but because of a severe headache, he quickly went home and went to bed. Toward evening, he felt better and decided to take his dog out for a walk again. However, on this approach to the park, he was stopped by the police. Stagg calmly answered all questions and gave his details. The police had no evidence against Stagg, but he seemed to them to be a suitable candidate for the role of the killer. In addition, the press kept pressuring law enforcement agencies, and they needed a breakthrough in the case urgently. That same day, Stagg was brought to the police station, where he was held for 3 days. When questioned, he denied any involvement in the murder, but the detectives were beginning to believe more and more the opposite. First, occult books were found in his home, which coincided with the profiler's suggestion. Second, the police were able to find 2 women who gave some disturbing details about Stagg. One woman accused him of exposing himself in front of her in that very park. In his defense, Colin said he was just sunbathing in a secluded part of the park and the woman came there herself. Another woman reported that she had been exchanging intimate letters with him for some time. In one of them, he confessed to her that he dreamed of having sexual intercourse outdoors. All this was already enough for the police to consider Colin a pervert and finally believe his involvement in the murder of Rachel. Except they knew that all these circumstantial arguments would not stand a chance in court. For this reason, the man had to be released. On the advice of his lawyer, he agreed to pay a fine for exposing himself to a woman in the park, though he continued to insist on his innocence. Detectives, along with a profiler, came up with a very unusual plan that was supposed to help force a confession. A Metropolitan Police officer, under the pseudonym Lacey James, began writing Colin letters of intimate content. She said she knew the woman Stagg had corresponded with before. Despite the ridiculousness of the situation, the plan worked. Colin responded to all the letters, and each time their dialogues became more and more explicit and perverted. Lizzie played the part of a woman with violent and sadist hobbies, sometimes even illegal, and their communication lasted 5 months. All this time, Stagg insisted that they finally meet in person, and the detectives decided it might actually help to get a confession out. The location and date was set at a park. Lizzie didn't go there alone, but Stagg didn't know that. Plainclothes officers were keeping an eye on them in case the man decided to attack their colleague. During the conversation, Lizzie, on the provider's advice, shared with Colin a fictional story about her secret hobbies. She revealed that her ex-boyfriend was into the occult and that they performed a ritual sacrifice on a living person together. Stagg took this information rather calmly. At least he kept in touch with Lizzie, and they spent a few more hours together and parted ways. After that, they met a few more times, and finally, the police decided to move on to the final part. Walking in the park, Lizzie talked to Colin about Rachel's murder. She told him that she wished he had been the murderer because she was aroused by thoughts of the crime, but it didn't work. Stagg apologized to her and told her that he had nothing to do with the murder. Lizzie tried to get him to confess several more times, but he kept denying his involvement. It looked as if the police had botched a 6-month operation. They couldn't get any evidence that Stagg had killed Rachel, but the detectives were still convinced they were right. That's why they did arrest him in August 1993. At the interrogation, Colin was told all the cards and that all this time he had been in correspondence with a police officer. He was read excerpts from these letters describing various perversions and was also introduced to the real Lizzie herself. Stagg was shocked, but on the advice of his lawyer, refused to answer police questions. Investigators had hoped to the last that under such pressure he would confess to the murder, but he did not. All they had to do now was to take the case to trial. All this dragged on for a year, which Stagg spent in custody. When the case finally went to trial, his lawyers blew the prosecution's arguments to smithereens. Even the judge was forced to admit that the whole operation with Lizzie James was overkill and that the police had behaved in an extremely unprofessional manner. In September 1994, Collin was acquitted of all charges and released. Lizzie James later resigned from the police, citing serious psychological trauma from the operation. The police, who had spent more than £3 million on this investigation, were deadlocked. They had not a single suspect, and most of the detectives continued to think that Stagg was the murderer, and they were not alone in this opinion. The newspapers and the public continued to blame him for what happened. Every time he went out on the street, he caught the embittered looks of passerby. Almost the entire country believed that the murderer had gotten away with it, and this only added to the hatred towards Stagg. This went on for years. The Rachel Nickell case was finally hung in the balance, and the police made little effort to look for new suspects. Why, when they were all sure of Collin's involvement? By then, Rachel's husband, along with Alex, had gone to live in Europe for several reasons. First, he was constantly harassed by journalists, which reminded his son of his mother's murder. Secondly, the father felt it was not safe for his son to remain in London. He was the only person who saw the murderer. For a long time, no one knew which country they had moved to. Later, journalists did get wind that they lived in Spain and France. In 2000, Scotland Yard took up the case and assigned a new team to it. They studied all the collected material and witness statements, but they failed to find a new suspect. Only 3 years later, they announced that they had found DNA from an unknown man on Rachel's clothes. Analysis technology had only just matured to such a capability, and in 1992, such a discovery was simply impossible. Even in 2003, this tiny sample, which took experts 18 months to find, was not enough to establish identity. The data from that sample was only enough to rule out unsuitable people. And a year later, in 2004, the police finally had a new suspect. His DNA was already in the database, and a comparison with a sample from Rachel's clothes showed mixed results. That man was the 38-year-old Robert Napper, a convicted murderer and serial rapist who, at the time, had already spent 10 years in a halfway house. His biography is striking in two ways: the cruelty of his crimes and the ease with which he evaded justice. Later, because of this, the police would face a wave of outrage from the public. Napper first came into the hands of law enforcement in 1986. He was then given a suspended sentence for assault with an air gun. In 1989, he broke into a young mother's house and abused her. For the next 4 years, there was a series of similar attacks, but the police did not tie them together and could not reach the suspect. What followed was something truly amazing. Napper confessed to his mother that he had carried out all these attacks. She called the police and told them everything. And what do you think? They found no connection between the crimes and the woman's story, so they didn't look into Napper's involvement. The only thing the mother could do was convince her son to see a psychiatrist. When Napper came back from there, he said that the specialist thought he was crazy, but took no further action. A short time later, he assaulted and abused a woman and her child in Crystal Palace Park. This happened just weeks before Rachel's murder, but again, the police failed to see the connection. This was by no means the only such attack in Crystal Palace Park, and police at some point figured out that one man was committing the crimes. From the words of witnesses, they compiled a sketch of him. After the publication in the newspapers, several of Napper's neighbors contacted the detectives. They all pointed to the man, and the police called Napper for a blood sample. He simply ignored the request, and the detectives did not go looking for him. They simply forgot about him. In November 1993, London was rocked by another high-profile crime, which, as it later turned out, was also committed by Napper. A young mother, Samantha Bissett, was attacked in her room. In addition, the perpetrator did not spare her young daughter. What he did to them shocked even experienced detectives. The police photographer who arrived on the scene could not return to work for several months because of the shock of what he saw. Remarkably, the same profiler who had been brought in to investigate Rachel's murder worked on all of these cases, and he believed that all of these attacks had nothing to do with each other. The detectives also saw no possible connection to the Rachel case because they were 100% sure that Colin Stagg was guilty. The team of investigators handling the attack at Crystal Palace Park also saw no connection. Napper was nearly 190 centimeters tall, and based on witness testimony, the perpetrator was shorter. But the maniac made one mistake in the attack on Samantha Bissett. He left a fingerprint in her apartment that allowed his identity to be run through the database. Napper had previously been fingerprinted after he stalked a woman in the street. He was not arrested until May 1994. When questioned, he denied guilt and was extremely calm. In his apartment, they found maps of London on which the locations of the attacks and murders were circled, including the place where Rachel was murdered. They also found several notes on how to properly abuse women. Shortly before that, police found a knife in the very park where Rachel was murdered. The fingerprints on the handle matched Napper's, but even that wasn't enough to make detectives consider him for the killer because they were still convinced Colin Stagg was guilty. Napper, however, was still considered a suspect in Rachel's murder for a while, but those charges were quickly dropped. The thing is that Napper said he was at work that day. In 1995, Napper went on trial for the murder of Samantha and her daughter. The prosecution struck a deal with him in which he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and the court sent him to a closed psychiatric hospital instead of prison. The fact was that Napper had been diagnosed with a number of disorders, including Asperger's syndrome and schizophrenia. Because of this, the maniac could have avoided prison anyway, with or without a confession. As a result, the judge sent him to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital for treatment, with no time limit. Later, detectives wanted to question him about Rachel's murder, but the doctors forbade it. They feared it might aggravate Napper's mental status. Back to 2004, the new team of detectives on the Rachel Nickell case finally began to take a closer look at Napper as a suspect. After they compared his DNA to a small sample found on the young woman's body, the results were very mixed. That sample wasn't enough to confirm the similarity. It was only enough to rule out other suspects. In Napper's case, the results did not do with 100% certainty. Investigators kept digging further using new technology. On Rachel's clothing, they managed to spot a microscopic piece of paint. Experts examined it and concluded that it matched the paint on Napper's iron toolbox. Prior to his arrest, he worked as a storekeeper for the Department of Defense. It is not entirely clear how he could have gotten a job there with his set of mental disorders, but the fact remains, he combined assault and murder with his day job. It took Scotland Yard 3 years to prepare this case for trial, and in 2007, Napper was charged with the murder of Rachel Nickell. During the first hearing, he pleaded not guilty, which prolonged the trial for almost a year. In the end, Napper agreed the same deal he had been offered 12 years earlier, a change of plea to manslaughter in exchange for a confession. On December 18, 2008, 16 years after the murder, he finally confessed. For Napper himself, the verdict did not change anything. He was left in the same hospital under heavy guard. Most likely, he will never be released, but the news made a lot of noise all over Britain. The police suffered the most, fixating on Colin Stagg and completely ignoring on Colin Stagg and other serious leads. Instead, the investigation was divided into 3 separate lines. Each team of detectives looked for different criminals, while behind all the attacks and murders was Napper. That same year, 2008, Stagg sued the police department for £706,000, a record for Britain for unwarranted criminal prosecutions. The Metropolitan Police also issued a public apology to him. He subsequently wrote several books about his life experiences. In them, he described what it was like to be accused of murder. Stagg admitted that for 10 years, his life was effectively ruined by journalists and the police. After the whole of Britain finally believed in his innocence, he decided to spend all the compensation on travel, expensive cars, and other things that brought him joy. In 2010, a special commission issued a report criticizing the actions of homicide detectives. This document was called a catalog of wrong decisions and mistakes. And the reason for this is not only the fact that the murder could not be solved for 16 years. The whole point is that if the police had done their job properly, they could have arrested Napper before he killed Rachel, Samantha, and her daughter. No disciplinary action followed, however. All the detectives involved in the case retired, and one of the lead investigators passed away. As for Rachel's son, Alex, he did not give his first interview until 2017, 25 years after the incident. He said that growing up without his mother had been problematic, but that he had found the strength to let go and move on. Shortly before the interview, he went to the very place where his mother was murdered, and in that moment, he was able to finally let go of the heavy weight of the past. One can only hope that this story, like others like it, will serve as a lesson for law enforcement agencies around the world. It is too late to speculate about whether or not the police could have saved Rachel and Samantha, but it is never too late to draw conclusions and prevent future crimes. Missy Gruball was born April 26, 1974, in the American city of Burleson, Texas. Her family lived very modestly, so in her school years she got various part-time jobs to pay for her own college education. In addition, she received good grades and was an active participant in the life of the local church. Even before her graduation, Missy decided that she wanted to become a teacher, and in 1992, she went to the University of Texas at Arlington. It was about 40 kilometers from her home, and Missy decided to rent a place closer to campus. What's more, she took 2 jobs to pay her rent and tuition without the help of her parents. But sometimes even that wasn't enough to cover all her expenses. Once, she had to skip an entire semester to earn more money during that time to continue her studies. Sometimes she also worked part-time as a nurse, taking care of children. Despite such a busy schedule, Missy called her mother every day when she got home. It became something of a tradition for them. Her daughter would call her and tell her that she had returned from work, even if it was already nighttime. On the evening of April 7, 1994, Missy also called her mother. They talked until about midnight. The young woman was in good spirits and preparing to celebrate her 20th birthday, which was only a few weeks away. Around 3 a.m., the local police department received a call from Missy's neighbor who lived downstairs. She reported that there was a loud noise coming from the apartment upstairs, like broken glass and banging. She thought there might have been a robbery going on and decided to call the police. The squad arrived on the scene, and a few minutes later, the fire department received a call to the same address. It turned out that there was a fire in the house, so in addition to firefighters and police officers, an ambulance also arrived there. Upon arrival, firefighters evacuated the residence and proceeded to extinguish the fire. Given the building was small, they quickly managed to find the seat of the fire. It was the apartment on the second floor where Missy lived. When they entered the apartment, they saw a terrible sight. There was the young woman lying on the bed without any clothes on, and the fire was burning all around her. The firefighters immediately realized she was dead, so as soon as the fire was extinguished, the police arrived. They determined from the first second that the young woman had not died from the fire. They noticed several stab wounds on her body, which caused a lot of blood on the bed. As for the fire itself, firefighters immediately opined that it was purposeful arson. Moreover, when they first arrived at her apartment, they smelled a strong odor of gasoline. After examining the apartment more thoroughly, the firefighters were conclusively convinced that they were dealing with arson. Someone had poured gasoline all over the apartment and left, leaving the dead young woman inside. However, the perpetrator had closed the front door, which made the extent of the fire not as large. There was not enough oxygen in the apartment to keep the flames burning. The police quickly identified the deceased as Missy Gruball. In the meantime, her body was handed over to medical examiners, and they conclusively confirmed that the young woman had died before the fire started. This was confirmed by the stab wounds on her body and the lack of smoke traces in her lungs. If the victim had been alive when the fire started, even when she was unconscious, she would have inhaled smoke and the experts would have noticed it. They also determined that the young woman had been abused and were able to extract a sample of the perpetrator's DNA because of it. The police found a knife in Missy's apartment, which they believed was the murder weapon. Unfortunately, no prints were left on it. Apparently, the killer had washed it in the sink before setting the fire. Nor could the DNA sample from the victim's body help them get a lead on a suspect. In 1994, there was no way yet to load that data into the database to match the DNA of previous convictions. But the police had their first lead almost immediately. It turned out that a week before her death, Missy had filed a police report on a co-worker she had worked with at the coffee shop. A young guy had lost his place and was looking for someone to stay with for a while until he could find a new apartment. Of all his co-workers, Missy was the only one who agreed to help and let him stay with her. She even gave him a spare set of keys so he could leave and return regardless of her. The co-worker only lived there for a few days. One day, Missy came home from work and was about to put the tips she had received for the day into the piggy bank. She kept saving small amounts to add to her tuition and rent, and by then she had almost $1,000 in her piggy bank. But that day, the young woman discovered that all her money had disappeared. She immediately blamed her coworker, since no one but him had spare keys. He denied guilt, but Missy threw him out and reported him to the police. But when they started looking for him, the guy had quit his job and disappeared. So the investigators had a pretty good suspect. The guy had keys to Missy's apartment, so he had no problem getting in. When he found out the young woman had gone to the police, he might have held a grudge against her and decided to get revenge. If he didn't know that Missy had already gone to the police, he might kill her just to keep her from doing it. While the cops were searching for this guy, they started working on another clue. Letters from a certain young man had been found in the victim's apartment, and, judging by their contents, he and Missy were having some sort of affair. They didn't live very far apart, but they exchanged letters regularly. The young woman was a deep believer and had never had a boyfriend before. She also mentioned in her letters that she wasn't ready for any kind of intimate relationship until after marriage, and her companion was of the same opinion at first. But over time, the contents of his letters became increasingly intimate, and Missy wasn't happy about it. The detectives decided to run the man through the database and, to their surprise, discovered that he had a prior conviction for violent acts. Given that Missy had also been abused before the murder, this was enough to make the young man a suspect. He was found and questioned, but he denied any involvement, but he had no solid alibi. The boy said he was sleeping alone in his house at the time of the murder. However, Missy was killed between midnight and 3 a.m., so his alibi didn't seem all that dubious. But the detectives were in no hurry to drop the charges and asked him to volunteer a DNA sample. The guy agreed and they let him go. Unfortunately, in those years, DNA analysis took more than a month, and it had only been a few days since Missy's murder, so detectives had to wait at least a month for experts to isolate the DNA profile from the victim's body, and then wait another month to compare it to the guy's sample. So investigators began looking for other leads, and soon they had a third suspect. The management of the cafe where Missy worked told them about an incident that had happened shortly before her death. The young woman complained to the manager that one of her coworkers, named Jeff, had stolen some items or money from the cash register. The theft charges were confirmed and the man was fired. Afterwards, he caught up with Missy and began accusing her of losing his job and leaving him without a livelihood. During this conversation, he said he was going to kill her. The police also discovered that Jeff had tried to win Missy's affections, but she rejected him. This also may have served as an additional motive. All this was more than enough for the police to question the man. But while the detectives were trying to find out his address, something unexpected happened. Jeff's girlfriend came into the station and said she was afraid of her boyfriend and suspected him of killing Missy. It turned out that the man had not been home the night of the murder, and he had never told his girlfriend where he was since then. She also said that Jeff had a very bad temper and often exhibited outbursts of aggression. The man repeatedly mentioned the story that he had been fired because of a complaint from Missy, and he had been furious about what she had done. When he did get found and brought in for questioning, he acted very brazen. Jeff kept smiling and bombarded the detectives with various stories that were odds with reality. He claimed that in fact Missy was obsessed with him and wanted to date him, and that was why his girlfriend had gone to the police to get revenge. He also stated that he was at home with his girlfriend the night of the murder, which contradicted her story. When the detective said that his girlfriend denied this alibi, he just laughed. That said, Jeff did agree to provide his DNA sample voluntarily. Given that there was no evidence against him and the DNA analysis could have taken over a month, he had to be released. But a few days later, Jeff's girlfriend called the police. She was extremely disturbed and told them that the guy had kidnapped her from her parents' house and held her hostage for 8 hours, threatening to kill her if she tried to get away from him. Eventually, he let her go, and the young woman immediately contacted the police. They immediately began to search for Jeff, but by then he had already escaped. In spite of this, the detectives were almost certain that he was behind Missy's murder. They put out a search for him on a kidnapping charge, but the man seemed to have vanished. Meanwhile, experts at the lab were able to determine the blood type of the owner of the DNA sample found on the victim's body. They also had samples from Jeff and Missy's boyfriend, and both had a different blood type. This came as a surprise to the detectives. They were almost certain that Jeff was the killer, but the data from the lab disproved that theory. Thus, they were left with only one suspect who had not given his DNA sample and who had not yet been found, a colleague of the victim who she had allowed to stay with her. However, a month had passed since the murder, and the police were still unable to track him down. But suddenly, they had a new lead no one was expecting. Missy's mother called the investigators and said she remembered a strange detail the young woman had told her on the phone a few days before she died. She didn't give it much thought and didn't decide to share it with the police until a month later. As mentioned earlier, Missy sometimes worked as a nanny, and one of her regular clients was a young couple who lived in the same complex. They had a young child, and the woman was pregnant with her second. Her partner, Luis Arroyo, also worked in the same restaurant as Missy, so they often saw each other and talked. According to the mother's story, a few days before her daughter's death, the man came to Missy's house to talk. Even though it was getting close to nightfall, she let him in. Luis told her that his relationship with the young woman had been strained lately and that he just needed someone to talk to. But what followed was something that struck the police as extremely strange. Missy told her mother that after the conversation, they got into a mock pillow fight. It was hard for detectives to imagine a 32-year-old man and father coming to a 19-year-old young woman's house near midnight and then having a pillow fight. But according to Missy's story, that's exactly what happened. In a conversation with her mother, she didn't give it much thought, but the police decided to check on the man. They found out that Luis had no criminal history, had served in the army, and was a model employee at the restaurant. But after talking to his coworkers, the detectives learned a very interesting fact. Of course, after Missy's murder, the restaurant employees were constantly discussing the subject, and one day Luis said, "I hope they catch whoever killed and raped Missy as soon as possible." A little later, he added that they might never find the culprit because all the evidence was burned in the fire. The problem was this: the police never disclosed that the victim had been abused before she died. It wasn't in the newspapers or reports. It wasn't even reported to her mother. So the detectives had a logical question. How did Luis know about it? When questioned, the man stated that he and Missy did talk a lot, but that he had nothing to do with her murder. He was calm and forthright in answering all of the police questions until the detectives asked him for a DNA sample, at which point Luis became visibly nervous. He asked why they needed his DNA, since the fire was supposed to destroy all traces of the perpetrator and his sample would have nothing to compare it to. You have to agree, that sounds pretty strange. It is worth noting that the police also did not disclose the fact that the experts received a sample of the killer's DNA. Therefore, no one knew whether they had this evidence or not. After these words, the detectives explained to Luis that they had a sample of the killer's DNA, and the man's behavior changed dramatically. He said he urgently needed to take his child somewhere and left the station, promising to come back the next day to take the DNA test, but he never came. A day later, the police went to his workplace, but the man was no longer there. The manager said his girlfriend called and asked to give Lewis a couple of days off because he had to leave town. Along with this, the detectives discovered another interesting fact. Lewis had married his girlfriend the day after he was questioned. At this point, they could only guess what was behind the move. But first, the investigators decided to talk to his wife. She said that on the day of the murder, Lewis called her from work and said he was going to a bar with friends. He came home around midnight, took a shower, and said he was going for a run. He returned after 2 a.m., and his wife noticed that he smelled strongly of smoke and gasoline. The man was also coughing constantly, and his nose had traces of soot in it. His wife asked him what had happened. Lewis then told her that he had run by Missy's house and noticed the fire. He went up to her apartment and saw that the place was engulfed in flames, and the young woman herself was lying on the bed. Lewis tried to save her by giving her artificial respiration, but the smoke and flames forced him to run outside. Apparently, his wife was quite satisfied with the story, and they went to bed. As you have already realized, the detectives found a number of suspicious points in the story. Even setting aside the fact that the man decided to go for a run in the middle of the night, his further story defies any logic. First, how could he have gotten into Missy's apartment without keys? After the fire, forensics determined that there were no signs of forced entry on the door. This means that Missy let her killer in on her own, and according to Lewis's story, he entered her apartment when she was already dead. Second, if his story is to be believed, he had just seen a dead young woman he had known for a year in a full-blown fire in the house next door, but instead of calling the fire department and the police, he decided to just go to bed. His wife apparently didn't see fit to do anything about the situation either. The police also learned Lewis's blood type from his wife. It matched the blood type found on the victim's body. All of the above was enough to put a man on the wanted list, but his whereabouts remained unknown. The wife also asserted that she didn't know where her husband had gone, but the detectives didn't believe her. By then, they suspected that the woman was deliberately covering for Lewis. In their opinion, he had told her a greatly altered story about the murder in which he had no choice, or Missy had attacked him herself. In other words, he had convinced her under some false pretenses not to cooperate with the police. But everything changed when the detectives told the woman that Missy had been abused before she died. Almost immediately thereafter, Lewis's wife told them where he might be. At about the same time, police officers from the city of San Antonio found a burnt-out car that belonged to Lewis and that his mother lived in the same city. Detectives went there and found the man himself, after which he was arrested. At the station, he acted extremely tense, lying on the floor, crying, and generally looking like he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But during his interrogation, Lewis stated that he had indeed gone to Missy's apartment that night and had been intimate with her in a consensual manner. This account did not go well with the fact that the young woman's body was found with many wounds and bruises, not to mention the fire. Next, Lewis's story became frankly bizarre. He said he didn't remember how events unfolded after that, but he may have stabbed her while denying that he had set the apartment on fire. The man did not actually deny his involvement in the murder, but he did not confess either. This made the detectives' job difficult, but now they could take a sample of his DNA. At that point, they already knew that Lewis's blood type matched the killer's, and all they had to do was wait for the DNA results. Sometime later, the experts found a perfect match, and Lewis was charged with murder. Given that he did not actually confess directly, the case went to trial. The man continued to insist that he and Missy had a consensual intimate relationship that night. As for the murder, he continued to give some vague version. Lewis supposedly had no recollection of stabbing her, but did seem to recall taking a knife from the kitchen. He said the same thing about the fire. He remembered that there was a fire in the room, but he did not start it himself. According to the investigation, Lewis had long had a liking for Missy and in some ways was even obsessed with her. In favor of this one interesting fact, the man had worked in the same restaurant as Missy for almost a year, and he had moved into her compound 6 months before the murder. Considering that there were hundreds of similar complexes in their city, it would be logical to assume that Lewis had chosen this particular place for the sake of living closer to Missy. In addition, in the days before the murder, he had visited her around midnight for no meaningful reason, which also seemed odd to the investigators. According to their version, on the night of the murder, Lewis had gone to her apartment for the purpose of inducing Missy to have intimate contact. The young woman, who was a virgin at the time and was saving herself for marriage, rebuffed him, and Lewis flew into a rage. He abused her, then killed her, and went to get gasoline. After setting the apartment on fire, he returned home and told his wife some made-up story in which he made up what had happened as an accident. Perhaps the story about the run and the attempt to save Missy came about only after investigators began to suspect Lewis and informed him that the fire had not destroyed the killer's DNA. Upon learning this, Lewis could have convinced his wife to tell the police how he had tried to save the young woman with CPR. Apparently, his wife really didn't know the truth. She was also not charged in any way. Detectives speculated that Lewis had married her, only that she would be legally entitled not to testify against him. As for Lewis himself, the court sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of petitioning for parole in 2034. Apparently, he had hoped for a reduced sentence, recounting his memory loss that night and not directly denying that he could have killed Missy. But the court concluded that he had long sought to seduce the young woman and eventually decided to commit the crime, after which he saw only one way out: to kill Missy to avoid prison. Thus, the police were able to solve a very complicated case in which, of the 4 suspects, the most unobvious was the culprit. They only drew attention to him thanks to Missy's mother, who decided to share a strange but insignificant detail. Perhaps Lewis would have gotten away with it if it weren't for that little detail. And lastly, as for Jeff, he was found after all and jailed for 4 years for kidnapping his own girlfriend. Carrie Nelson was born on December 13, 1980, in the small American town of Laverne, Minnesota. She had loving parents, a younger sister, and many friends. Carrie was kind, empathetic, and always tried to help her loved ones. After graduating from the local high school, she enrolled in college in the neighboring state of North Dakota. She wanted to become a doctor so that she could help others. While in college, she met a young man named Mike Kellen, and they became engaged after a while. Carrie tried to balance her college studies with part-time work at the National Blue Mound State Park, located near her hometown. Her duties included selling park tickets and escorting guests who came to relax at the camping site, go hiking, or see the bison. Carrie worked there for the 2nd season in a row, and she loved the place. In addition to being a relatively easy job, she could also spend a lot of time in nature, enjoying the picturesque landscapes. On May 20, 2001, she went to work as usual. That day, besides her, only one young woman named Rebecca, who was doing an internship at the park, was working there. In addition to her main duties, Carrie had to train and introduce her to the work process. Carrie's shift started at 8 a.m. and was supposed to end at 3:30 p.m. For most of the day, she was with Rebecca, explaining the work nuances. Around 12:45, Rebecca went to the office building located at the other end of the park, and Carrie stayed in a small room at the entrance. Rebecca returned around 2:30 p.m. She entered the building through the back door and immediately saw a horrific scene. Carrie lay motionless on the floor with a pool of blood near her head. At around the same time, a shocked Rebecca heard the front door. Thinking it might be the same person who attacked her colleague, she immediately ran out through the back door and rushed home. The young woman lived in a house located within the park grounds because her father was the manager, so she quickly ran there. Rebecca told her parents what had happened, and her father immediately ran there, while the young woman's mother called the police. The man arrived at the building and found no one there except Carrie. He tried to feel her pulse and realized that she was dead. After that, he closed the curtains, locked the front door, and called 911. At around the same time, another call came in to the police. It turned out that when Rebecca discovered her colleague's body inside, a park visitor walked in, not the attacker. The woman went to the registration desk and saw Carrie's body next to a puddle of blood, then returned to her car and also called 911. Police arrived on the scene and began their investigation. The young woman's body was lying behind the registration desk where phones and cash registers were located, and things and papers were scattered around. One of the phone receivers was off the hook, the plastic pen of Carrie's chair was broken, and its pieces were on the floor. Based on this, the police assumed that a struggle had taken place between the victim and the attacker. After talking to the managers, the investigators found out that 2 bank bags intended for money storage had disappeared from the building. In addition, cash was taken from the cash register, with the total amount stolen being approximately $2,000. On the floor, detectives found several clues: men's wristwatches with a torn strap and a pack of cigarettes. Considering that Carrie did not smoke, the police assumed that the cigarettes were left by her killer. As for the watches, they assumed that the young woman tore them off the perpetrator's wrist during the struggle. Large particles of orange-colored stone were also found on the floor. The manager told investigators that these particles likely came from the decorative stone with the park's name, which was located on the registration desk. The police searched all the rooms and could not find the perpetrator. Considering that blood spatters were visible on the walls and ceiling of the room, they immediately assumed that this stone was the murder weapon. At the same time, their colleagues blocked the road leading to the park entrance and began questioning all visitors. The couple who stopped at the campground reported that around 2:30 p.m., a white car with a brown vinyl top drove past them at high speed. Unfortunately, they did not remember the model or license plate number of the vehicle. The investigation was complicated by the fact that there were no surveillance cameras in the park since crimes were very rare. The available evidence included a wristwatch, a pack of cigarettes, and the vague testimony of witnesses. Medical experts examined the victim's body and concluded that the cause of death was blows to the head with a heavy object. They suggested that the perpetrator may have used a large decorative stone, but this version could only be confirmed after its discovery. According to the investigators, the attack on Carrie occurred between 2 p.m. and 2:30 p.m. They found a love letter that she had written to her fiancé at her workplace. In the letter, Carrie expressed her eagerness for their wedding and described her desire to have 2 children. She put the date and time of 2 p.m. that day on the letter. Another interesting fact was that the men's watch found next to the victim's body stopped at 2:16 p.m. Perhaps they stopped working just after Carrie had taken them off her attacker's wrist. Police cordoned off the park and began searching for additional clues. 5 days later, they found the decorative stone in a nearby stream. Apparently, the killer took it with him and threw it into the stream from a bridge while driving over it. Medical experts compared the relief of the stone with Carrie's head injuries and confirmed that it was the murder weapon. However, the water had washed away all fingerprints and DNA traces that the perpetrator may have left. No other clues were found, and the police began searching for a possible suspect. They first looked closely at Carrie's fiancé, but he had a reliable alibi. At the time of the murder, he was attending a funeral about 110 kilometers away from the park. Around 3 p.m. that day, he tried to call Carrie at her work phone. At that time, he had no idea that his fiancée was dead. Detectives interviewed park employees and received an interesting lead. Several people told them that Carrie had complained to them multiple times about her 26-year-old colleague named Stephen. Carrie reported that he continuously asked her out on a date, despite her being engaged. Stephen ignored her refusals and behaved quite persistently, causing Carrie to fear him. Additionally, the man used heavy narcotics and sold them to park visitors. Carrie mentioned to her colleagues that she was considering reporting him to the police or management. The detectives immediately questioned him, and he did not have a reliable alibi for the time of the murder. He did not work that day and claimed he was at his daughter's birthday party a few kilometers away from the park. However, he arrived at the party around 3 p.m., which means he could have had enough time to commit the crime. In addition, he drove a white Cadillac, while witnesses saw a light-colored vehicle leaving the park at high speed. Digging deeper, the detectives found out that Stephen had financial difficulties. This gave him a motive to commit robbery, especially since he knew where the money was kept. The detectives also suspected that he may have learned about Carrie's plans to report him and decided to murder her. They seized his car and took a DNA sample from him. Meanwhile, the forensic team finished collecting fingerprints and DNA samples from the crime scene, including DNA from a men's wristwatch. In total, 135 different fingerprints were found at the scene, excluding all park employees, including Stephen, leaving 38 unknown prints. As for the wristwatch, 3 different DNA samples were found on it. The problem was that these samples were not enough to create a full profile, since DNA analysis technology was not yet advanced enough in 2001. As a result, experts had to work with partial profiles. They tried to add them to databases, but the results were inconclusive. The system showed them 19 possible matches, and during the investigation, the police confirmed that none of these people were related to the murder. However, the experts were able to directly compare the obtained samples with other DNA. They determined that one of the samples belonged to Carrie, and the other 2 did not match any of the park employees, including Stephen. Detectives did not rush to rule him out, as he had a motive and opportunity to commit the crime, but there was no evidence against him. No other leads were found, and the case remained unsolved for months. A year after the murder, a prisoner serving time in the local jail came forward to the police. He told them that his cellmate, Anthony Powers, had boasted to him about being responsible for Carrie's murder. Detectives investigated and found that Powers had an extensive criminal history, mostly for bank robberies, which had landed him in jail multiple times. Interestingly, Powers had escaped from prison shortly before Carrie's murder and was caught after the fact. His fingerprints and DNA did not match those found at the crime scene. Moreover, the witness's description of the murder did not match reality. The detectives concluded that both prisoners were attempting to deceive them for a reward of $50,000 for information leading to solving of the case. Since Powers was already serving a life sentence, additional charges did not scare him. Additionally, in the event of a guilty verdict, he could have avoided being transferred to a federal prison and remained in the state correctional facility, which he preferred. The case remained unsolved for several years. Detectives regularly reviewed the case, hoping to find new evidence, but their efforts were fruitless. They even put up a photo of Carrie in their office to remind themselves of the case every day. In 2007, the case was reopened. By that time, DNA analysis technology had significantly advanced, and experts re-examined the wristwatch. This time, they were able to identify 3 precise DNA profiles, one belonging to Carrie, the second to an unknown man, and the third to an unknown woman. Both of these samples were run through the state database, but no matches were found. Then the detectives remembered an interesting detail. A special sticker was found on the pack of cigarettes discovered next to the victim's body. In those days, each state had to label tobacco products, so the police knew for sure that the pack was purchased in South Dakota. The detectives then sent the DNA samples to their colleagues in that state, and here they had a long-awaited breakthrough. When they ran these profiles through the South Dakota database, one of them showed a complete match. The man turned out to be 35-year-old Randy LaRoyal Swaney. This name had never appeared in police reports in Carey's case, so it was a surprise for the investigators. Randy turned out to be a serial robber, and at that time, he was serving a 30-month sentence in a South Dakota prison. At the time of the murder, he was out on parole. The police also discovered that he had a light-colored Oldsmobile Delta at that time, which matched the witness's description. The investigators checked his fingerprints, and they matched several prints found at the murder scene. Despite all this, the detectives wanted to gather as much evidence as possible before charging him. Randy had only 1 month left to serve in prison, so the police decided to act as quickly as possible. They spoke to his wife, not mentioning what her husband was suspected of. The woman was already used to Randy regularly coming to the attention of the police for robberies and thefts, so she was not surprised by their visit. The detective showed her photos of a watch, and the woman immediately confirmed that they belonged to her husband. She also said that she sometimes wore them, and the investigators immediately realized that the last DNA sample from the watch belonged to her. Then they decided to reveal everything and told her that they suspected her husband of killing a young woman. The woman burst into tears, but the police quickly realized that she was primarily scared for herself. Learning that her DNA might be on the watch, she thought that she too would be accused of the murder. On April 19th, detectives came to visit Randy in prison and attempted to speak with him without specifying what he was being suspected of. However, Randy refused to talk without a lawyer present. After the unsuccessful interrogation, Randy called his wife. As all prison calls are recorded, the police were able to listen in. The woman was angry and asked, "What did he do?" She revealed that detectives were investigating him for a murder that occurred in Blue Mound State Park and was more worried about her DNA being found on a watch. At times, she began to cry and scream that she didn't want to go to jail for a crime she had nothing to do with. Randy, on the other hand, repeated that he knew nothing about it. The woman actively cooperated with the police, providing her DNA samples and allowing them to search their home. She also gave them several photos of Randy, one of which showed him sitting behind the wheel of a white car similar to the one witnesses saw. In another photo, the man's watch was visible and was fastened to the fourth clasp, just like the watch found at the crime scene. Additionally, his wife confirmed that Randy smoked the same brand of cigarettes that were found near the body. All of this was enough to take the case to trial. Randy was charged on May 8, 2007, one day before his release. He was immediately transferred to a prison in Minnesota, and the prosecution began preparing for the trial. According to their version of events, Randy initially chose the park building as an easy target for robbery. There were no cameras or guards, but there was cash. When he entered, Carey may have been in another room. Seeing that nobody was there, Randy began stealing money from the cash register, but the young woman returned and caught him in the act. A struggle ensued, and the man may have used threats to make her open the safe. Afterward, he took a decorative stone and struck her more than 5 times because he feared leaving a witness alive. Even his relatives, including his wife, testified against him in court. They all said that Randy regularly committed thefts, used banned substances, and had serious gambling problems, which constantly put him in debt. His former cellmate told how Randy mentioned leaving his watch at the crime scene. Another cellmate claimed that after the police came to interrogate Randy in jail, he said, "This time they got me. I'm looking at life." Randy's lawyers insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder. According to their version, Randy lost his watch sometime before the incident, and the real killer found it. However, this version conflicted with the results of DNA analysis. There were 3 samples of genetic material on the watch: Randy's, his wife's, and Carrie's. Randy claimed that on that day, he went fishing near a town about 150 kilometers away from the park. However, since he supposedly was there alone, no one could confirm his alibi. He also said that he had been in the park only once, long before the murder. He admitted that he left his fingerprints there at that time, but there was another discrepancy. One of Randy's fingerprints was found on a leaflet that was made only 4 days before the murder. All defense arguments had no weight and contradicted real evidence, and Randy's lawyers tried to blame someone else. First, he called Powers and another inmate to testify, but their stories still did not match reality. Then he began to harass the victim's fiancée, constantly hinting that he could be the real killer. The trial lasted until August 15, 2008. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Randy guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After that, he continued to insist on his innocence and filed multiple appeals, but they were all rejected. From the beginning, all his defense was built on absurd versions that contradicted DNA analysis and other evidence, so there are no chances for his case to ever be reconsidered. Inga Lotz grew up in an affluent and well-off family. Her parents, Jan and Juanita Lotz, were quite prosperous and respected individuals. Her father was a respected professor of radiology at the University of Stellenbosch, and her mother was a physiotherapist. Inga excelled in school, demonstrated talents in singing and playing the piano, and was known for her kindness and responsiveness. After completing high school, she enrolled in the University of Stellenbosch, where she successfully pursued a bachelor's degree in mathematics and later continued her studies in the master's program. Inga was one of the top students at the university, always in the spotlight. Her pleasant appearance, cheerful demeanor, and friendly nature attracted a following. In 2004, Inga began dating Fred van de Veyer, a 22-year-old fellow student who had already earned a bachelor's degree and was working at a well-known insurance company in Cape Town. Fred came from a wealthy farming family, was educated, and well-read. Despite dating for only about 6 months, Fred was seriously considering marriage and had met Inga's parents, introducing her to his own. In early March 2005, Inga moved into an apartment in a prestigious residential complex on the outskirts of Stellenbosch. Considering the city's high crime rate and frequent incidents of violence against women, Inga took precautions for her safety. Hence, she chose an apartment in this residential complex, meeting high security standards including high walls with electric fencing, remote-controlled gates, and surveillance cameras throughout the complex. Inga gradually settled into her new apartment, furnishing it and making minor repairs. On March 16, 2005, the police received a call reporting the discovery of the body of a young woman with signs of violent death in an apartment under surveillance. Police quickly arrived at the crime scene and found Inga Lotz lying on the couch. Upon initial examination of the body, investigators identified signs of a brutal assault on the young woman. Detectives discovered that the victim had a broken nose and had sustained multiple deep blows to the head, neck, and chest with a heavy object, presumably a baseball bat or hammer. The girl's left arm showed significant swelling, while her right arm had numerous bruises and deep cuts on the wrist, and her legs and lower abdomen were covered in bruises. Detectives suspected that the victim had clearly attempted to defend herself against the assailant. During the examination of the apartment, investigators found no signs of forced entry or robbery. Valuable items were in plain sight, and the victim's personal belongings, money, and phone were untouched. The only items missing were a kitchen knife and the remote control for the gate of the residential complex. On the investigators' coffee table, they found a DVD disc box with a single fingerprint, and in the bathroom, a single bloody shoe print, presumably from the perpetrator. Considering the nature of the injuries inflicted on the girl, investigators speculated that the motive for such a murder could be intense personal animosity. Detectives found it peculiar that there were almost no bloodstains in the apartment, only a small puddle near the victim's head and a few drops on the floor. However, the character of the injuries suggested that there should have been more bloodstains in the apartment. Investigators also noted the almost perfect order around, which seems strange given the bruises on the girl's body, indicating that she likely resisted the attacker. Taking all these circumstances into account, the investigating officer hypothesized that the girl's murder likely occurred elsewhere, and her body was later moved to the apartment. According to the forensic examination, the girl had suffered a severe blow to the head with a heavy object, possibly a hammer, followed by numerous knife wounds to the neck, arms, legs, and abdomen, totaling more than 40 stabbed wounds, as determined by experts. A few hours after the discovery of Inga Lotz's body, the news of her death made headlines across the country. The photograph of the beautiful, smiling girl appeared on the front pages of newspapers nationwide. Relatives and close friends of the girl were shocked and devastated by this tragic news, and everyone was puzzled about the motive behind the attack and the identity of her killer. Police continued their investigation on hot leads and learned that the girl's body was discovered by a young man named Christo Pretorius, a mutual friend of Inga and Fred, who lived adjacent to the girl. Christo Pretorius explained that on the evening of March 16th at 10:30 p.m., he went to Inga Lotz's apartment at the request of her boyfriend, Fred van der Vijver. Fred had been unable to reach her for quite some time during the day, and considering that Christo lived in the adjacent building, he was the quickest to check if everything was okay with the girl. Upon reaching Inga's apartment door, Christo rang the intercom several times, but received no response. He then started knocking on the door, but still no one answered. Christo listened closely and thought he heard the sound of a television inside. Turning the doorknob, he found the door unlocked. The apartment was dark, but the living room was visible in the light from the working television. Christo spotted the figure of a woman lying motionless on the couch, and upon closer inspection, recognized her as Inga, her head and face covered in blood. The young man immediately called the police and informed Fred about the incident, who became the next person interrogated by the investigators. Fred shared that he had been trying to reach his girlfriend, Inga Lotz, all day and grew seriously concerned when she stopped answering his calls. Worried, Fred called Inga's mother, who mentioned having talked to her daughter around noon and assumed that Inga might have turned off her phone to focus on preparing for an upcoming university exam. Despite this, Fred persisted in trying to reach Inga and around 10 p.m. decided to go to her home to make sure everything was okay. However, as he needed to first visit Inga's mother to obtain spare keys to her apartment, and this would take some time, he asked their mutual friend Christo Pretorius, who lived next door to Inga, to check on her. It was from Christo that Fred learned about the tragic death of his girlfriend. Interviewing Inga's friends and family and examining surveillance cameras at the nearest store, the police established the timeline of that day. In the morning before her university lectures, Inga briefly met with Fred. After classes, she had lunch with childhood friend Vimpai Boshoff, who incidentally was the last friend to see her alive. Returning home at 13:15, she allowed workers, who were doing minor repairs in her apartment, to enter. By the time they finished their work, she was on the phone with her mother, who mentioned hearing Inga escorting the workers to the door and locking it. At 13:36, Inga sent Fred a final SMS message. Later, Inga was captured on surveillance cameras at a store where at 14:55 she purchased a hamburger at a restaurant, picked up a DVD from a local rental, and bought a magazine before returning home. From that point, her phone went silent. Continuing the investigation, detectives learned that on the day of the murder, there was a power outage in the residential complex and at the gates, which were guarded entrances, for several hours. This was due to the work of electricians installing a fan in the trash chute room and construction workers laying tiles and repairing balcony doors. As a result, the home was left without security and surveillance for a few hours. At this stage, the investigators' suspicion centered on Inga's closest circle of friends and acquaintances. Among those who came under suspicion were childhood friend Vimpai Boshoff, former boyfriend Brown Kruger, friend and neighbor Fred Marius Botha, and, of course, Fred van der Viver himself. Both Vimpai Boshoff and ex-boyfriend Brown Kruger had alibis supported by witnesses and were excluded from the list of suspects. Later investigations revealed that Fred had a solid alibi. He was in his office throughout the day, confirmed by eyewitness testimony. Surveillance camera footage showed him entering the building at 11 o'clock and leaving at 1800 hours. He was not seen on camera at any other time. Despite this, detectives continue to suspect him, convinced that the perpetrator was someone Inga knew well, and the press and police believed that Fred, being a jealous and controlling boyfriend, fit this profile perfectly. Journalists uncovered some details about the couple's relationship that gave the police grounds to seriously suspect Fred van der Viver. Despite the outwardly prosperous appearance of Fred and Inga's relationship, it was far from ideal, with serious disputes and arguments arising between them recently. According to Inga's friend Vimpai Boshoff, during that lunch, Inga admitted that her relationship with Fred was on the verge of breaking up. She revealed that they had a serious disagreement that morning, and she wasn't sure if things would improve after that. Inga mentioned that she wanted to get engaged to Fred by the end of the year, but her father expressed concerns. From the beginning of their relationship, he noticed that Fred manipulated and controlled every move Inga made. The girl's mother also shared her husband's concerns. In their last meeting, she noticed bruises on her daughter's arms, which Inga attributed to gym workouts but wore a long-sleeved sweater despite the warm weather. The mother also witnessed a phone argument between Inga and Fred, during which Inga asked him not to come anymore and leave her alone. However, over the weekend, contrary to her daughter's wishes, Fred still visited. According to the mother, the boyfriend closely monitored the girl, telling her how to behave, what to wear, and with whom to associate. During the funeral arrangements, disagreements arose between the girl's parents and Fred, as he took charge of everything without consulting them. After a few days, when Fred was found rummaging through Inga's belongings in the closet, the girl's father asked him to leave their home and never come back. During the forensic examination of the sole fingerprint found on the DVD box, it was determined to belong to Fred. Consequently, the inference was drawn that Fred was in Inga's apartment after 1500 hours, presumably at the time of her murder, as the disc was rented by the girl at 14:55. During the search at Fred's house, investigators found the young man's athletic shoes, and the footprint from them matched the bloody trace discovered in Inga's bathroom. Focusing on the search for the murder weapon, the police found that Fred owned a decorative hammer given to him by Inga's parents as a Christmas present, serving as a bottle opener. It was kept under the front seat of Fred's car and had never been used. Combining all the evidence and analyzing Fred's movements on the day of Inga's death, the police found inconsistencies. At that time, it was known that Fred arrived at the company where he worked around 11 a.m. and attended a meeting with colleagues at 13:10. From that time until 15:15, Fred did not use either his computer or his phone. Investigators speculated that he could have left his workplace through the company's parking lot between 15:30 and 17:15, remaining unnoticed by surveillance cameras. 3 months after the girl's murder, rumors circulated in the media that the police were about to arrest Fred. His lawyer advised him to surrender voluntarily, and Fred complied. The young man agreed to undergo a polygraph test to prove his innocence and successfully passed it. However, considering the substantial amount of evidence against him, Fred was formally charged, leading to his arrest. After a 2-year investigation, in early 2007, the trial of Fred van der Vyver began and lasted for 9 months, making it one of the most prominent and controversial cases in South Africa's history. Fred's family sold their farm to hire and finance his defense. The key piece of evidence in this case was the fingerprint, and Fred's family enlisted an American fingerprint expert who made a sensational statement. He claimed that the fingerprint supposedly found on the DVD box was actually lifted from a cylindrical surface, such as a glass, and not from a flat surface like a box. This fingerprint underwent re-examination, and forensic experts determined that it was indeed lifted from a glass, while the one taken from the DVD box was apparently lost or mixed up with other prints. As the prosecution presumed, this fingerprint on the DVD box was considered to be the murderer's print, and the case against Fred was essentially built on it. However, mysteriously, this crucial fingerprint disappeared. This was just one of many investigative errors that would be exposed during the trial. The defense pointed out that 5 police officers, during the crime scene inspection, freely roamed around the apartment, confusing and destroying evidence. The defense also argued that Fred could not have left his workplace, committed such a heinous crime, returned, and managed to clean up within such a short time frame. Colleagues who saw Fred at work on that day described his behavior as calm and well-balanced. Additionally, the defense's expert provided evidence that the bloodstain from the shoe in the bathroom did not match Fred's footwear and might not be a footprint at all. Regarding the murder weapon, the decorative hammer, no blood or DNA traces were found on it. Upon re-examination, it was determined that it did not correspond to the size of the wounds inflicted on the victim. Consequently, the case against Fred van der Vyver fell apart in court, and in November 2007, he was acquitted. After that, the investigation into the case came to a halt, but the grief-stricken parents of Inga continued to fight for justice, insisting on a reassessment of the evidence and the reopening of the case. They did not want the memory of their daughter to be forgotten, organizing rallies, distributing pamphlets, and even hiring private detectives. In March 2012, when Inga's parents offered a reward of 1 million rand, about $80,000, for information that could lead to solving her murder, renewed interest in finding those responsible for the young girl's death emerged. Media reports indicated that during the investigation, detectives obtained information that Inga had received anonymous threatening phone calls for several weeks leading up to her murder. The calls were traced to a public telephone booth near her residential complex, but no clear suspects were identified in the surveillance camera footage. The content of the calls was not disclosed to the public, leading many to speculate and guess about potential motives for the girl's murder. At the same time, investigators explored the theory of the involvement of one of Inga's classmates in her murder. It was discovered that shortly before the murder, the girl had a serious quarrel with a fellow student over a research project. The dispute was so intense that Inga filed a complaint with the university's disciplinary council against this student. Although she was questioned by the police, no direct evidence linking this incident to the murder was established, and the suspicions against the girl were lifted. To this day, nearly 2 decades after the murder of Inga Lotz, the case remains unsolved. The circumstances of her death, errors in the police investigation, the sometimes appearing, mysteriously disappearing evidence, the contradictory legal proceedings, and unanswered questions have made this case one of the most perplexing in South Africa. Over the years, several books have even been released based on this story. However, for the girl's family, the pain of losing their only child and the thought that the killer has not been justly punished have not diminished for a moment. Amanda Lenke was born on June 7, 1991 in Tennessee. She grew up in a large and friendly family with several brothers and sisters. Later, they moved with their parents to Spring Hill, Florida, where Amanda attended the local middle school. She was passionate about dancing, writing poetry, playing multiple musical instruments, and was a very positive child. During school vacations, Amanda always went to her grandparents' house in a small town called White Cloud. She loved spending time there as she had many friends in the town. White Cloud was a quiet and peaceful place with a population of only 1,400 people. Most of its residents knew each other, children played without supervision, and no one worried about their safety. In 2004, when she was only 13 years old, Amanda finished the 7th grade of middle school and went to White Cloud for the whole summer. She spent a lot of time with her friends, went for walks, and enjoyed her vacation. On June 20th, Amanda stayed overnight at her best friend's house. They talked, had fun, and went to bed late at night. In the morning, her friend woke up and found that Amanda was not in the room. The bedroom windows were wide open. She went to the kitchen, walked around the house, but Amanda was nowhere to be found. It was strange because all her belongings, including clothes and a backpack, were left in the bedroom. The friend told her parents that Amanda was missing, and they called her grandparents. They walked several streets and called the parents of Amanda's other friends, but no one had seen her. Then the relatives decided to go to the police. They understood that Amanda could not have gone anywhere without warning, especially in just her pajamas. First, investigators talked to Amanda's friend. According to her, she didn't hear anything that night, and Amanda never told her that she was planning to leave. At the time of the disappearance, the friend's parents, as well as her brother and sister, were in the house. None of them heard or saw anything. Police tried to find witnesses who lived near the house, but they also hit a dead end. On that night, no residents noticed anything strange. On the first day of the investigation, the investigators concluded that the girl, with a high probability, had left home on her own initiative and run away. They argued that they found no signs of struggle in the house and that 5 people did not hear anything. It was difficult to imagine a scenario in which Amanda could have been abducted without waking up her friend who was sleeping just a meter away. This version caused outrage among Amanda's relatives. They insisted that the girl had no problems at home and was happy to spend the entire summer in White Cloud. In addition, they pointed out that the girl left all her things, including clothes, in her friend's room. According to the police's version, she decided to run away in just her pajamas. When the news of Amanda's disappearance spread throughout the district, the police received several calls from people saying they had seen a similar girl in different places. This only reinforced the detectives' confidence that Amanda had run away from home, but they could not confirm any of these leads. The investigators decided to check the girl's computer, hoping to find some information that could help in the search. They found correspondence with a certain young man, and based on this, the police assumed that Amanda ran away to meet him. However, there were discrepancies. There was no mention of a possible meeting in these correspondence, and it was about ordinary and everyday topics. Nevertheless, the investigators considered this enough to once again convince themselves of their correctness. At that time, they did not disclose all the details of the investigation, but information about correspondence with a certain guy spread throughout the city, so many local residents also began to think that the girl simply ran away from home. Meanwhile, her relatives were posting flyers and giving interviews to various media outlets. They insisted that Amanda could not have run away on her own initiative, and the police were not putting in all the effort to find her because of this misconception. The investigators did not really use the full range of their capabilities. If they officially considered this case as a kidnapping, they could have involved the FBI and other agencies in the investigation. Instead, they were convinced that the girl simply left home and, for this reason, searched for her half-heartedly. They never found any serious leads on Amanda's possible location, and the investigation stretched on for several weeks. On the morning of July 5th, mushroom pickers went to a forest located approximately 10 kilometers from White Cloud, where they found a human body and reported it to the police. Investigators arrived at the scene and immediately recognized the body as Amanda Lanke. She was wearing the same pajamas she had disappeared in from her friend's house. Later, medical experts officially confirmed her identity and determined that Amanda had received multiple blows from a heavy object and died on the night of her disappearance. Detectives concluded that the victim had been killed elsewhere and then brought to the forest. They could not find any significant leads, so they decided to interview everyone who knew the girl. Over the next few days, police questioned approximately 400 people, which constituted almost one-third of the entire population of White Cloud. Investigators even used a polygraph, but it did not yield any results. They also decided to take another look at the young man with whom Amanda had corresponded online. The problem was that the word killer was used in his nickname. Police considered the possibility that the victim actually went to meet him and he killed her. However, this version still had many inconsistencies. There was nothing to suggest that the girl would have gone to meet someone in her pajamas in the middle of the night. Furthermore, there was no hint of a personal meeting in their correspondence. The investigator could not identify this person, and soon the version of his involvement was no longer considered. In an attempt to get some new leads, detectives decided to study all of Amanda's belongings, which led to a breakthrough. They found her personal diary, which contained very disturbing information. Shortly before her death, Amanda wrote that a certain man had been harassing her, and the next several pages were torn out. Investigators suspected that his name was written on them. This diary immediately became the main lead in the case. Police tried to identify the man's identity. They talked to all of Amanda's friends and asked if the girl had mentioned anything about this. Several of her friends admitted that she had indeed told them about it and even named the man, Cecil Wallace. He was the stepfather of Amanda's friend with whom she had stayed the night. For detectives, this information was a real surprise. They had been looking for the killer all over the town and beyond, and in the end, the possible culprit was in the same house as the victim. But the testimony of the friends was not enough to arrest him. Investigators had no substantial evidence against the man. No DNA samples were found on the victim's body, and the court documents did not indicate whether she had been subjected to violence. Detectives questioned Wallace, but he denied any involvement in the crimes. The police themselves wondered how the man could have done all this unnoticed in a small house where his wife and 3 children slept. Without serious evidence or confession, they could not detain Wallace. Therefore, the detectives continued to work on all possible leads. Soon after, an interesting fact emerged. It turned out that Wallace's sister, Candace, worked in the police department that was handling Amanda's case. Moreover, the woman actively helped her brother and his family during the interrogations. She literally told him what to say and how to behave. But that was not all. 5 years ago, she was fired from another police department for falsifying a report on her brother's accident. She wrote that he was driving on a road when a deer ran out in front of him. However, in reality, the man was drunk and had an accident. By that time, other detectives were already handling Amanda's case, and they questioned the objectivity of the investigation by the local police. However, they could not confirm that anyone other than Candace could be helping Wallace. The investigators questioned the man and his family several more times, but all of this did not yield any results. They continued to look for any leads, but in the end, this case stretched on for several years. During this time, the Wallace family complained several times to the police that their home had been vandalized. The fact that the townspeople unanimously believed that the man was a murderer and that he was being covered up by his sister only increased the negative sentiments. The fact that Wallace continued to live among them freely only intensified these feelings. 4 years after the murder, in 2008, detectives turned to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children for help. They sent their investigators to White Cloud, where they reviewed all the case materials, conducted new interrogations, and tried to find new leads. Ultimately, they came to the same conclusion as the local detectives. There was not enough evidence to make an arrest. 3 more years passed, and in 2011, the police finally got a new lead that changed everything. A 27-year-old girl from Texas who grew up in White Cloud went to a news website from her old town. There, she came across information about Amanda's murder and started looking into it. After reading that the victim had spent the night at the Wallace house, the woman decided to go to the police and tell them something disturbing. In 1998, when she still lived in that city and was 13 years old, she stayed overnight at the Wallace house because she was friends with his second foster daughter. In the middle of the night, a man entered their room and assaulted both of them. He then threatened them to keep quiet. The victims were too scared to go to the police, so they never told anyone about what had happened. But after the adult victim learned about Amanda's case, she decided to contact the police. Furthermore, she wrote a statement to the police, which helped investigators to get closer to the arrest of the suspect. They interviewed a large number of White Cloud residents who could potentially have been affected by Wallace's actions, and this tactic worked. They were able to find several women who admitted that the man had touched them inappropriately. All of this happened between 1998 and 2002. The victims were then between 13 and 16 years old. Gathering all this information together, in October 2011, police arrested 43-year-old Wallace. He was charged with molesting these victims, as well as the man who was officially named as a suspect in Amanda's case for the first time. Knowing all that other women had told them, detectives had no doubt about his involvement in the murder. At the preliminary hearing, he was granted bail of $150,000, and somehow he was able to pay this amount. Apparently, his sister and other relatives helped him gather the money. The trial was supposed to begin in a month. While waiting for this, Wallace returned to work. The local residents were unhappy that he had been released on bail. They repeatedly protested outside the company's office, demanding that this man be fired. On November 10th, on the day of the first court hearing, an unexpected turn occurred. Wallace did not show up at the appointed time. and the police immediately declared him wanted. A few hours later, they managed to find his car in the woods near the city. The man was there too. The only thing was that he had taken his own life. Detectives, who did not expect such a turn of events, were forced to continue the investigation. After the suspect's death, they could only rely on significant evidence that could link him to Amanda's death. They obtained a search warrant for his home, trying to find anything related to her murder. The police examined every corner, tore down some walls, and removed floorboards, but they could not find any serious evidence. Afterwards, they shifted their focus to the suspect's sister, Candace. Detectives were certain that she was covering up for her brother and wanted to find out if she knew that he had killed Amanda. After gathering the necessary evidence, Candace was arrested in August 2012. She was charged with intentionally misleading the investigation, but that was only the beginning. During the investigation, detectives found out that Candace had been covering up for her brother during the times when he was dealing in illegal substances. Furthermore, she taught him how to not leave any evidence at the crime scenes. She showed him how to properly wipe his fingerprints off surfaces so that experts couldn't lift them. Candace also advised him to always carry a cigarette with someone else's DNA on it, so that if necessary, he could plant it at the crime scene. Detectives also concluded that at least 9 people knew about Wallace's crimes, but remained silent. All of them were members of his family. The police were unable to prove their guilt. The investigation into Candace's involvement continued for 2 years until 2014, when she made a deal with the police. She admitted to lying to the investigators, and in exchange, 2 other charges were dropped. The issue was that Wallace's sister could not provide consulting services on a case that she was working on as a police officer. Given that she had been helping her brother through interrogations, she broke this rule and was ultimately punished for it. However, Candace continued to insist that her brother was innocent. The court sentenced her to 30 weekends in jail. This is a dubious practice where the convict is only required to be in the jail building for 2 days a week and can freely roam during the rest of the time. Such sentences serve as a kind of half measure, and if a person has committed a minor offense, they can be given several weekends in jail. This way, they receive a punishment, but it does not strongly affect their life. The convicted person can continue to go to work and spend time with their family. Of course, Amanda's relatives were extremely dissatisfied with this decision. They, like the detectives, were sure that Candace had helped her brother avoid punishment. Proving it 100% was not possible. Therefore, she got off with such a minor punishment. The Amanda's family was forced to go through yet another trial. In 2004, medical experts only handed over part of her remains to them so they could hold a funeral. The rest was to be kept by detectives during the investigation, but after Wallace's death, a decision was made to hand over these remains to the relatives. In 2013, the girl's family had to exhume her remains to bury Amanda again. Her mother still hopes that investigators will find any evidence that will prove Wallace's guilt. She also tries to achieve changes in the legislation to change the police approach to searching for missing children. The woman insists that investigators should not conduct an investigation based on their subjective assessments and consider the disappearance as a voluntary escape from home. Thus, there is almost no doubt that Wallace killed Amanda. But what was his motive? Considering that there is no information in the court documents about whether the victim was subjected to violence, 2 assumptions can be made. He probably did assault her but did not leave his biological material, so the investigation decided not to reveal this fact since it was unnecessary. Detectives could also keep this information secret for the sake of the investigation, hoping that the criminal would reveal facts that had never been told. His past crimes also speak in favor of Wallace being the killer. he assaulted at least 3 victims using the same scheme. All of them stayed at his house overnight. The question remains, why did he kill Amanda? Perhaps he planned to intimidate her like the others, but the girl threatened to tell the truth to everyone. Or she tried to run away from him and then he panicked. Something else in this case is very alarming. Detectives suggested that all of Wallace's relatives who were in the house on the night of the murder knew about this crime and even helped the man hide it. In addition to Amanda, his wife, son, and daughter were there. This could explain how he managed to attack the victim without waking any of his relatives. In any case, even without a final verdict from the court, Wallace will no longer be able to harm anyone. The fact that he settled the score with his life before the trial once again speaks in favor of his guilt, even though he took the details of this crime to the grave. Leslie McCrae was born on April 14, 1968, in Jacksonville, Florida. She was kind-hearted, determined, outgoing, loved to have fun, had a sharp mind, and a great sense of humor. Leslie grew up in a loving family, but was particularly close to her 4-year younger cousin Joey. Despite living in different cities, the girls tried to spend as much time together as possible. Leslie even considered moving to her city when she turned 18. After graduating from high school at the age of 17, Leslie enrolled at the University of North Florida, dreaming of building a career in the modeling industry. She moved out of her parents' house and into an apartment complex with her 21-year-old boyfriend, Edgar McQuarrie. On the night of December 24, 1985, they were sleeping in their apartment when Edgar woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise. To his horror, he saw a man with a knife above their bed. The unknown criminal tied Edgar's hands and feet with ties, threatening him with a weapon to prevent him from resisting. He then tied up Leslie in the same way and took her out through the back door of the apartment. Edgar, still tied up, could only watch in horror as the kidnapper took Leslie away. It took him 3 hours to free his hands, and around 6 a.m., he called the police. Detectives arrived at their apartment, took Edgar's statement, and began searching for Leslie. Considering that the room was almost pitch black at the time of the abduction, Edgar could not see the perpetrator's face or any other distinguishing features except for brown hair. The police also did not know what kind of vehicle the kidnapper had used, although it was evident that he had used some form of transportation to abduct Leslie. While detectives were trying to find witnesses and examining the street, they received a call at their station. 3 hours after the kidnapping, a man went out for a morning run and noticed a female body lying in a ditch next to the road, 8 kilometers away from Leslie's apartment. The investigators arrived at the scene and immediately identified the young woman. Her body was covered in various injuries. Some of her clothing was torn or missing. Medical experts determined that the young woman had received more than 20 sharp object wounds, and there were also many bruises on her body. In addition, the killer had subjected the victim to violence, and experts were able to extract his biological material. Considering that DNA analysis was not yet used in those years, this evidence could not help the police identify a suspect. There were no other useful clues at the scene, so the investigators decided to focus on examining the victim's apartment. Soon, they had serious doubts about what had happened that night. According to the victim's boyfriend, the criminal had quietly entered the apartment, but no signs of a break-in were found, and there were no signs of a struggle in the rooms. In addition, the back door through which Leslie was allegedly taken out was covered in cobwebs and no fingerprints were found on it. There were no shoe prints despite a thick layer of dust around it. All of this suggested that the boyfriend's story may have been fabricated, and in that case, an obvious question arose. Does he have anything to do with the murder? However, this version had its nuances. The investigators doubted that the boyfriend could have taken out and killed his girlfriend, then returned to the apartment and called the police. Experts suggested that her body was dumped on the street after Edgar called 911, so he was no longer considered a suspect. Over the next few months, the detectives tried to find new leads, but each time they hit a dead end. As a result, the investigation was finally suspended in 1986. The criminal's biological material, which was the only serious evidence in this case, could not help the investigators at that time, and they hoped that in the future, this clue would lead them to the killer. For many years, this case sat gathering dust in archives, but Leslie's relatives never lost hope of finding the culprit. They reached out to various authorities and gathered information themselves that could be useful in solving the case. However, their resources were limited, so they were unable to find any new leads. In 2010, Leslie's mother, Sarah Adams, was diagnosed with a serious nervous system disease that practically robbed her of her ability to speak. Despite this, she continued to maintain contact with investigators through notes. After that, Leslie's cousin Joey became the most active in the search for the truth. Although she and her family lived 2 hours away from Jacksonville, she regularly traveled there to speak with investigators or help Leslie's mother. However, attempts to reach out to the police practically led nowhere. Detectives were not eager to reopen the investigation, considering the lack of new evidence. Additionally, they were occupied with ongoing criminal cases, so they were in no rush to take on a decades-old murder case. As a result, Joey began to accuse the detectives of being negligent in the early stages of the investigation, or even covering up the perpetrator. She even suggested that the killer may have bribed investigators, but she had no evidence to support this theory. Joey also regularly gave interviews to local news channels, trying to draw public attention to the case. She recalled the time spent with her older sister and described Leslie as a cheerful and positive person. She also regretted that her 2 children never got to know what a wonderful aunt Leslie could have been to them. In late 2018, her relatives' persistent efforts produced the first results. They contacted representatives of the Cold Case Files project, and they became interested in Leslie's case. This nonprofit organization, which began in 2015, focuses on unsolved murders in which police have been unable to find the perpetrators. The organization collects and disseminates information, engages in dialogue with investigators and the media. In addition, they provide support to the victims' relatives, advising them on communication with the police and journalists. The organization's employees posted information about Leslie's murder on various resources, trying to attract as much attention as possible to the case. In such cases, when investigators have not been able to solve the case, public interest can play a key role. Firstly, the more people hear about this crime, the more chances there are that potential witnesses to the event will be among them. Sometimes people, without realizing it, may have seen or heard something that could lead the police to the killer. Secondly, under pressure from the public and the media, the chances of detectives reopening the investigation increased. Throughout this time, they had the perpetrator's biological material, but to study it, they needed to reopen the case, which police officers often do not do due to a lack of personnel or funding. The organization worked together with Leslie's relatives for several months, and they really managed to draw attention to this case. They wrote in the news and talked about it in reports, and in June 2019, representatives of a popular local TV channel contacted the family. They offered to record a large-scale interview in which relatives could talk about Leslie and their years-long attempts to seek the truth. Her cousin and mother accepted the offer and met with journalists. They told them about who Leslie was as a person, showed her photos, and were dismayed by the fact that the police had not been investigating the case for over 30 years. In addition, in the interview, relatives mentioned they believed that the boys Leslie mentioned were her killers, and in their opinion, her story about a man with a knife was not trustworthy. The boy himself could have killed her, but the journalists decided to cut this moment out, as Edgar was not a suspect in this case and there was no evidence against him. Representatives of the TV channel contacted the sheriff's office, hoping to get some additional information, but the police refused to comment. They referred to rules that prohibited them from discussing with journalists cases that were not currently under investigation. Leslie's family was disappointed with this outcome, but they were not going to give up. Joey continued to write letters to investigators demanding that the case be reopened, and ultimately it paid off. The family was able to organize a meeting with law enforcement representatives, and detectives indicated their intention to revive the investigation. The Leslie family was interviewing again, and the police began to re-examine the evidence. In April 2020, they sent biological material from the victim's body to a laboratory, and soon experts extracted a DNA profile, which was entered into the FBI's national database and immediately received a match. Almost 35 years later, the investigators finally had a possible killer's name. He was 58-year-old David Nelson Austin. After studying his biography, the detectives found many interesting moments. His DNA was in the FBI database not just by chance. Since 1991, the man had been serving a sentence for 2 sexual crimes committed in 1988 and 1990. At that time, he lived in Michigan, where he moved from Florida. Detectives determined that at the time of Leslie's death, he was living in Jacksonville and was 24 years old. 2 months before the murder, he attacked a mentally disabled young woman and attempted to assault her, but he failed. The man was arrested, but the justice system treated his act very lightly. Austin received no serious punishment and remained free. In addition to this, he had a whole series of less serious crimes, including drug possession, disturbing the peace, and more. Detectives had no doubt that he was behind Leslie's murder and began preparing the case for trial. Gathering all the necessary materials, in early 2021, they went to the Michigan prison to interrogate Austin for the first time. The man denied his involvement, but no one was going to believe him on his word. Investigators took his DNA sample to directly compare it with the biological material found on the victim's body. This had to be done as part of the standard procedure, and the result was expected: a complete match. In August 2021, Austin was officially charged with the murder of Leslie. Since then, detectives have been working to have him transferred from Michigan to Florida, where the crime was committed. The need for transfer was due to one simple fact: Florida had the death penalty, unlike Michigan, and Austin could have received that sentence for the murder of Leslie. The process took a year, until September 2022, when he was finally transferred to a correctional facility in Florida. He is currently behind bars, awaiting trial, and investigators have no doubt about his guilt. The only way for the perpetrator to avoid the death penalty is to make a deal with the prosecution and confess to the murder in exchange for another life sentence. During a press conference, investigators admitted that Austin was never a suspect in the case and was never questioned. According to them, the man did not leave any clues that the police could use to pursue him, and DNA analysis was impossible at that time. Furthermore, his DNA was only added to the FBI database in 1991, 6 years after the murder. Joey also gave an interview in which she said that she had always believed that Leslie's boyfriend was the killer. It was only after investigators revealed the real perpetrator's name that she realized that Edgar was also a victim in the story. It is expected that she will be the main witness in the trial. Leslie's mother said she forgave her daughter's killer, which surprised her family members, but they all respected her decision. Interestingly, Austin has a son named Owen, whom he has never met. Nevertheless, they regularly communicated via email. Journalists contacted Owen and learned that he was shocked by the charges against his father. Austin himself wrote to him about it, adding that he had nothing to do with this crime. At the same time, his son was well aware of other criminal episodes from his father's life, but continued to communicate with him. Austin's trial is expected to begin soon. If there are no bureaucratic delays, he may receive his sentence in a few months. Despite the fact that the truth has finally come out, the victim's relatives still blame investigators for negligence, believing that if they had periodically reopened this case, the perpetrator's identity could have been established in the early 90s rather than 30 years later. Andrea Michelle Bowman was born June 23, 1974 in New Orleans, Louisiana. At birth, her mother Kathy Turkanian named her daughter Alexis Miranda Badger. Kathy escaped to New Orleans in 1972 when she was 14 years old after hitchhiking from Virginia. She made a living working as a waitress. She soon met a young man whom she promptly married. After a year and a half of living together, when Kathy was not yet 17 years old, the couple had a young daughter, Alexis. After the arrival of the child, Kathy's relationship with her husband deteriorated. He began to cheat on her, did not help to take care of the girl. At the time, Kathy was only 17 years old and decided to take her daughter back to Virginia where her mother lived. But when she arrived in Virginia, she was faced with the fact that her mother did not want to keep the child as she was battling cancer. The difficult financial situation forced Kathy to give her daughter up for adoption, and at the age of 9 months the girl was placed in foster care, and soon after, at the age of 21 months, Alexis was adopted by a Bowman couple from Michigan, where she was given the name Andrea. Andrea's life in foster care was far from ideal. Just a few years after her adoption in 1980 in Ottawa County, Michigan, her adoptive father Dennis Bowman was arrested by police for assaulting a 19-year-old woman who was riding her bicycle along the road. After assaulting her and threatening her with a gun, he forced her into the woods where he intended to sexually assault her. At one point, the attacker's attention was distracted by a passing car and the woman miraculously managed to escape and call for help. In 1981, Dennis was charged with the crime and the court sentenced him to 10 years in prison, but he was eventually released early from prison in 1986 after serving only half of his sentence. Andrea was 12 years old at the time and had been living with her foster mother Brenda Bowman the entire time. The parole officer allowed Dennis to continue living with her foster daughter despite such a severe criminal record. In 1987, Brenda and Dennis had a daughter, Vanessa, and from that point on, the domestic relationship between the girl and her foster father seriously deteriorated. At the end of 1988, Andrea Bowman expressed concerns to her middle school staff that she was afraid to return home. They, in turn, reported it to the police, who interviewed the girl. During the interview, she claimed that her adoptive father had been physically abusive, harassed her, and had repeatedly used corporal punishment. Despite this, a social worker returned Andrea to the family. Dennis and his wife Brenda denied all these accusations, stating that the girl's behavior was a result of her recent discovery that she had been adopted as a baby and she was deliberately trying to hurt her adoptive parents. Soon after this incident, the Bowmans moved to a mobile home in rural Allegheny County. This was the last place Andrea Bowman was seen. On March 11, 1989, the family reported her missing. Dennis Bowman claimed that when he returned home from work in the evening, he found that his eldest daughter was not at home. Some of her belongings and $100 from a shelf near the front door were also missing. According to him, the girl was a difficult teenager, often argued with her adoptive parents, ran away to friends, and stayed overnight with them. Later that evening, Dennis and Brenda Bowman called all the neighbors, but none of them had seen the girl that day. Few neighbors doubted the official version of a runaway. Over the years, various rumors circulated about the family. For example, when Andrea was in middle school, there were signs of cuts on her wrists. Some kids gossiped about a suicide attempt, while others said that Andrea cut herself trying to escape through her room window, where her parents had locked her. There were various rumors that Dennis and Brenda were physically abusing their adopted daughter, prompting her to run away from the family. The police declared the girl missing and handed her case over to the juvenile department. In the months following Andrea's disappearance, Brenda claimed that she received calls from different stores reporting sightings of her daughter alive. Investigators investigated each such claim but found no confirmation. The case of the missing girl was widely publicized. Her photos were featured in the media and displayed on the city streets, but it still yielded no results, and the investigation came to a halt for several years. In 1993, the American alternative rock band Soul Asylum participated in a social project in which they released the music video for Runaway Train. The video featured images and names of missing children from across America. The video became very popular, and several versions were aired on various popular music channels. In the version shown in Michigan, Andrea's photo appeared, but despite the widespread resonance, no new developments in the investigation emerged. It wasn't until 2010 that an impassioned amateur, Carl William Koppelman, managed to break the case's deadlock. In his free time, Koppelman studied prominent unsolved cases, gathering information from the internet and cross-referencing facts. While examining publicly available information, Carl Koppelman noticed a resemblance between the missing Andrea Bowman and an unidentified girl found dead in a cornfield in Racine County, Wisconsin, in 1999. The girls shared physical characteristics, and their ages matched. Andrea would have been 25 in 1999, the same age as the unidentified girl from Racine. Additionally, Racine was not far from Andrea's previous residence. With this information, Carl Koppelman contacted investigators, who found it compelling enough to initiate an investigation. To determine if the unidentified girl's body belonged to Andrea, the police needed to conduct DNA testing on someone from Andrea's family. However, this task proved challenging as Andrea was adopted, and the police had no information about her biological relatives at that time. While the police searched for the girl's relatives, Koppelman continued searching for information about the Bowmans on the internet. One day, he came across Andrea Bowman's profile on a social network. Since it was a paid resource, indicating the profile's validity, Carl sent a message and received a response a few hours later. Turns out, Andrea Bowman's biological mother, Kathy Turkanian, managed the profile. Kathy began searching for information about her daughter many years ago, but during this time, she was unable to find anything. When she gave her daughter up for adoption, the child welfare authorities assured her that she would be able to reunite with her child when she turned 18, but that never happened. In 2012, Kathy received a letter from a social worker in Norfolk, Virginia, asking her to provide DNA for comparison with the results taken from an unknown girl in Racine County. The police believed that this might be her daughter, who had gone missing from her adoptive parents' home in 1989. Kathy's husband, going through missing persons lists and comparing birth dates, identified the girl as Andrea. Throughout this time, Kathy hoped to be reunited with her daughter, but instead, she learned that the child she had given up for adoption in the 70s had gone missing. Interestingly, Kathy had seen the music video for Soul Asylum's Runaway Train, which featured Andrea's photo, but she had no idea that one of the faces was her own daughter. Kathy underwent a DNA test, and in 2013, the long-awaited results confirmed that she was not related to the unknown girl found in Racine County. Later, through DNA analysis, it was proven that the body belongs to Peggy Johnson. From that point onward, Kathy actively participated in the search for Andrea. She created an online account, distributed flyers and T-shirts, and even offered a reward of $25,000 for any information that could help determine what happened to the girl. Most importantly, Kathy reached out to a retired detective from Michigan who had been involved in the investigation, seeking any official information about the girl's disappearance. The detective advised Kathy to pay attention to the Bowman family members. Upon requesting publicly available information, Kathy Turkanian was shocked to discover that the head of the family, Dennis Bowman, had multiple convictions. In addition to the 1980 case of assaulting a young woman in the woods, in 1998, he was arrested for breaking and entering a colleague's house with the intent of stealing items, including women's underwear. He was sentenced to restitution and 1 year in prison. Police records indicated that Dennis Bowman matched the profile of a sexual offender and was considered a potential danger to women. Learning these details, Kathy did not rule out the possibility that this man could be involved in Andrea's disappearance. Joining forces, Kathy Turkanian and Carl Koppelman hired private detective Jeffrey Floor from Michigan to conduct an investigation into Andrea's disappearance. Detective Floor conducted his investigation, gathered all available information on the case, and discovered several interesting details beyond the known facts. He interviewed residents of the town where the Bowman family lived and learned that Andrea was friends with her classmate Andrew Rand. They spent a lot of time at Andrew's home with his parents. One day, Andrea confessed to Andrew's mother that she didn't want to go home because her father mistreated her, and her mother, aware of it, either ignored it or pretended not to notice. At that time, interfering in others' family matters was considered unacceptable, even in such situations. Therefore, Andrew's mother, Arlene Rand, advised Andrea to talk to her clergyman for guidance on how to handle the situation. Once, when Arlene was driving Andrea home, Dennis Bowman came out of the house, approached the car, and rudely advised her not to meddle in others' affairs. Arlene got scared and tried to avoid Bowman, not telling anyone about the incident. A few months later, Andrea went missing. This information further convinced Kathy of the involvement of her daughter's adoptive father in her disappearance. She reported all the available information to the police, but since it was circumstantial evidence, the case did not progress, and the investigation again stalled for several years. Only in November 2019, Koppelman received information from a Michigan resident that Dennis Bowman had been arrested. He became a suspect in the murder of Kathleen O'Brien Doyle, the wife of a U.S. Navy pilot, and the sexual assault on her in 1980 when he was 31 years old. She was found murdered in her Norfolk, Virginia home on September 11, 1980. She had been stabbed and strangled. Dennis was one of 30 suspects in connection with this case. Investigators working on this case came to Michigan for a seminar and decided to check the DNA of the suspects for matches. Detectives were astonished to find a 100% match between Dennis Bowman's DNA profile and the DNA from the crime scene. He was immediately arrested, and a few months later, Bowman was extradited to Virginia to face trial. While in pre-trial detention, he confessed to the attack in 1980. Bowman, then 31, broke into the home of 25-year-old Doyle in Norfolk, Virginia, assaulted her with a knife, subjected her to sexual violence, and strangled her in the bedroom. In his confession to the police, Bowman claimed he was intoxicated and broke into her house with the intention of robbery. The revelation of this 40-year-old crime indirectly led Bowman to finally admit to what happened to his adoptive daughter. In January 2020, while in custody in Virginia, 71-year-old Dennis Bowman confessed to the murder of Andrea. This happened 31 years after she went missing. On February 4, 2020, in the backyard of Bowman's house in the 3200 block of 136th Avenue in Monterey, Michigan, police discovered skeletal remains buried under a layer of concrete. On the same day, a press conference was held, announcing the discovery of human skeletal remains under a concrete slab behind the house, likely belonging to Andrea Bowman. The police needed to confirm the identity, and Kathy immediately provided her DNA, which resulted in a 100% match. According to Dennis' testimony, on the day Andrea died, he came home and found her packing to run away. She told him that she would no longer tolerate his advances and intended to report them to the police again. They began to argue, and Dennis struck Andrea in the face. The blow was so powerful that she fell and broke her neck. Dennis claimed that Andrea's death was an accident, and he declared her missing to conceal it and remain free for the sake of his family and younger daughter. On May 15, 2020, the prosecution officially charged Dennis Bowman with murder, first-degree child abuse, and mutilation of a body. He was to be extradited back to Michigan to face trial on these charges. In June 2020, Dennis received 2 life sentences for his previous crimes, and he was ordered to serve his sentence in Michigan, where he would await trial for the murder of Andrea. The first court hearing for this case took place in February 2021, which, due to the pandemic, was broadcast live. The key witness at the hearing was Dennis' wife, Brenda. Tearfully, she recounted that when she reported their daughter missing, she was 100% convinced that Andrea had run away from home. She also revealed that she only learned the truth after Dennis was arrested. He confessed to her in a phone call from jail, explaining that he had buried their daughter's remains in the backyard of their home in Monterey. Brenda initially found it hard to believe because they were not living in the Monterey house when Andrea disappeared, and the body could not have been buried there. However, Dennis explained that he transported the girl's body in parts as soon as they signed the documents to purchase the house. The cement slab in the yard served as a makeshift grave marker, of which Brenda was unaware. Although she was innocent of the crime, her indifference and neglect towards her daughter led to such a tragic outcome and gave her husband the opportunity to act. She knew about his criminal past and his potential for wrongdoing, but chose to turn a blind eye. On December 22, 2021, Bowman pleaded not guilty to second-degree murder in connection with the death of 14-year-old Andrea in the Allegan County Circuit Court. He continued to consider it an accident. The next hearing took place in February 2022, and Dennis was sentenced to 35 years in addition to his existing term. The judge explained her decision by stating that a life sentence was considered, but she opted for the minimum term of 35 years for such a crime because a life sentence for second-degree murder leaves the possibility of parole after 15 years. Despite the verdict, the mother of the girl, Kathy Turkanian, did not find moral satisfaction. She accused Brenda Bowman, also implicated in the case, as Dennis continued his horrendous actions towards the girl with her silent consent. Kathy also claimed that she suspected Brenda might have known everything from the beginning and intentionally diverted police suspicion away from her husband by providing information about Andrea being seen alive and well in various places, which later turned out to be untrue. Currently, Kathy Turkanian is engaged in legal battles with Brenda Bowman for the right to reign to her daughter's remains. She believes that the Bowman family, after everything that happened, has neither moral nor legal claim to them. Many questions and grievances also remain regarding the police investigation, which was not properly conducted in the initial stages, and the available information was not thoroughly verified, leading to a prolonged and protracted investigation. Rachel Moran was born on January 17, 1981, in England. She was the youngest of 4 children with 2 sisters and a brother. They all lived together in a city called Hull. From a young age, Rachel was interested in music and dance, particularly ballet. She excelled in school and went on to attend a local college to study information technology. Later, she changed her focus and decided to pursue her passion for dance. While in college, Rachel met a guy named Mark, and the two soon started dating. After some time, they decided to move in together and rented an apartment in a quiet residential area. The residential complex was just a kilometer away from Rachel's parents' home, so she would often visit them. Rachel also got a part-time job at a local bakery as a cake decorator. She quickly fell in love with this activity and began to consider pursuing a culinary education. In December 2002, when Rachel was 21, she and her boyfriend decided to get 2 kittens. Rachel took care of them, devoting most of her free time to them. Rachel and Mark made sure not to leave the kittens alone for too long, so they always tried to plan their activities so that one of them was at home and looking after the animals. As a result, they had already planned how they would celebrate New Year's Eve. Mark was supposed to go to his parents' house and come back home by night, while Rachel planned to go to a bar with her brother and celebrate New Year's Eve there. After that, she was supposed to return with her brother to her parents' house and spend the night there. On the evening of December 31st, Rachel met up with her brother and they went to a bar. Some mutual friends joined them at the bar and the group celebrated the New Year. After midnight, Rachel and her brother left the establishment and arrived at their parents' home around 1:20 a.m. Before going to bed, Rachel talked to her mother and decided to call her boyfriend to see how he was doing. However, Mark did not answer the home phone, so she called his mobile. This time, he picked up and said that friends had invited him to a party. Rachel was upset that Mark had left the house contrary to their agreement and left the kittens alone all night. She decided not to stay at her parents' house and planned to go home. Upon learning this, her mother tried to dissuade her daughter, as it was late at night and she was concerned for her safety. Despite their lengthy argument, Rachel still headed home, promising to call her mother as soon as she arrived. Her mother waited for about an hour and a half, but there was no call from her daughter. She then called Rachel, first on her mobile and then on her home phone, but there was no answer. She thought that Rachel might have gone to the party where her boyfriend was, and that was why she wasn't answering the phone. The mother tried to reach her until about 4:30 a.m., but eventually decided to go to sleep. She woke up around 10 a.m. and saw that her husband was on the phone. She hoped that he had spoken to Rachel, but it was their eldest daughter on the line. She called her parents because she could not reach Rachel all morning and was causing her a lot of worry. Realizing that the young woman still hadn't returned home, all of her relatives began to panic. They continued to try to call her, and after some time, Mark answered the phone. The boy was surprised when he was asked, "Is Rachel home?" He said that he had returned home at around 7 a.m. and the young woman wasn't there. The young man thought that she had stayed overnight with her parents, so he didn't think much of it and went to sleep. According to Mark, there were no signs that Rachel had been home. Her things were missing, the bed was made up as it was when he left, and no one had fed the kittens. All of this made Rachel's family panic even more. They called all of their daughter's friends and other relatives, but no one had seen her that night. Rachel's parents then decided to contact the police. Despite the fact that Rachel was almost 22 years old and investigators could have waited some time after the disappearance of an adult, in this case, they decided to start searching immediately. They searched her apartment and talked to all of her relatives and friends. The police immediately dismissed the idea that Rachel had simply run away on her own. Her entire biography and stories from close people contradicted such a possibility. During the conversation with the investigators, Rachel's mother remembered one moment. That night when Rachel was going back to her apartment, her mother started arguing with her literally on the doorstep of the house where they stood with the door open, while the woman tried to persuade her daughter to stay. At some point, an unknown man walked down the street and Rachel's mother even thought about asking him to accompany her daughter home, but changed her mind. After receiving a rather superficial description of this person, the police began searching for him as he was walking in the same direction that Rachel was going to a few minutes later, so he might have seen something. They sent out descriptions to all patrol officers and continued to look for other clues. Detectives started to look into Mark, the boyfriend of the missing young woman. Firstly, they found out that there was an argument between them on the night when Rachel learned that he had gone to a party. Secondly, during the conversation with the police, Mark didn't seem upset despite his girlfriend's disappearance in the middle of the night. All of this led investigators to believe that he might have something to do with her disappearance, so they decided to check his alibi. Mark claimed that he returned from the party after 6 a.m. The police talked to all the people who were there, and they confirmed the young man's words. The young woman's relatives also insisted that he would never harm her. Investigators requested data from Rachel's mobile phone operator and bank. They found out that since her disappearance, she had not used her phone or bank cards. At that time, they could not track the location of her phone, and data from cell towers was practically useless at such a short distance. After that, the police decided to obtain all records from surveillance cameras within a 10-kilometer radius of her route. They sent patrols to every store and also spoke to residents in these areas, hoping that someone had security cameras installed. Soon, they managed to spot Rachel on one of the cameras just a couple hundred meters from her residential complex. This once again confirmed that she was heading home and not somewhere else. Detectives focused their search on this area. They brought in search dogs, helicopters, and dozens of officers who combed the streets, fields, and waterways. They also began to drain streams and artificial canals to fully search them, but all of this yielded no results. Days went by, and the police increasingly leaned towards the possibility that Rachel may no longer be alive, yet they continued their active and extensive search. 2 weeks later, they had their first worrying lead. One of the nearby channels had dried up, and they found Rachel's shoe inside, the same shoe she was wearing when she left her mother's house. The next day, they found a garbage bag in the same channel with a woman's purse containing cosmetics, a phone, and other items, including Rachel Moran's passport. These items led her family and investigators to believe that she was most likely dead, and the police continued to search the channels. They considered the possibility that an unknown perpetrator had dumped Rachel's body there, but further searches yielded no results. In the following days, detectives put even more effort into the case. They decided to use a popular tactic in England where police found a woman who looked like Rachel, dressed her in similar clothing to what Rachel was wearing on the night of her disappearance, and asked her to retrace Rachel's steps. The whole thing was filmed and later handed over to local TV stations by investigators. The purpose of this experiment was to find witnesses who may have seen Rachel on the night she disappeared, but didn't attach any significance to it or had forgotten. In this case, visual reconstruction of events might help them remember details, and it worked. After the footage was made public, several people contacted the police and shared their observations. The detectives checked them, but ultimately it didn't lead to any useful information. However, they did manage to obtain something significant. In addition to the witnesses, owners of CCTV cameras installed in the area also approached them. During the first few days of the investigation, the police had received most of these recordings, but they missed some, which proved valuable. The management of a school located approximately 150 meters from Rachel's apartment handed over their footage from the night. The police officer saw a woman walking in the direction of the same residential complex. The recording quality was very poor, but based on the time, investigators assumed it was Rachel. Just a few seconds later, someone else walked by, and the detectives thought it could be the unknown criminal who might have attacked her. Unfortunately, the recording quality did not allow them to see any features. Then the police assumed that if this person was behind Rachel's abduction, he wouldn't have been able to drag her body too far because he was without a car. They assumed the culprit lived in the area and decided to try to search every house within a 2-kilometer radius of that location. Of course, they needed the residents' permission as well as a lot of time. Therefore, the investigators hired more than 100 officers who knocked on all residential buildings and apartments asking for permission to search the premises. The police started their work on January 28th and divided themselves into groups of 3, each of which included a specialist who knew how to properly search the premises. Several hours later, one of these groups came to Nash Court Street, and the police officers began knocking on every door. After they reached the last apartment, something alarming awaited them. They immediately called the chief detective and asked him to come there urgently. When the police officers knocked on the last door, a man opened it and let them in. The officers searched the premises but didn't notice anything suspicious. However, before leaving, one of them saw a small garbage storage closet, which was quite common in such apartments, and they decided to check it out. But the closet door was locked. Officers asked the man to give them the key, but he said he couldn't remember where it was. They continued to insist that he look for the key to make sure that there was nothing in his apartment. The man searched the apartment, and after some time, he finally found the key. The police opened the door and found many garbage bags, empty packages, boxes, and other items inside. They began to clean up the mess since the closet was filled to the brim. At some point, one of the officers froze, having pulled out another bag. He saw a human foot. After a few seconds, he retrieved the rest of the garbage and realized that Rachel Moran's body was in front of him, wrapped in a blanket and barely fitting in the closet. The room was very low, and the officers were greatly surprised at how the criminal managed to fit a human body in there. The police immediately arrested the apartment owner and his friend, who was visiting him at the time of their visit. The tenant was 23-year-old Michael Little, who reacted calmly to his arrest, but his friend was shocked by what was happening. He did not see what was in the closet and did not understand why they were being detained. After arresting them, the officers called the chief detective and waited for his arrival. Initially, one car arrived at the scene and the police took the apartment owner's friend to the station. Little remained in the apartment with another officer, waiting for the next crew. The officer decided not to waste time and tried to talk to the man. To his surprise, Little almost immediately began to confess to all the details of what had happened. He started his story with the words, "I'm so glad you found her. I've been wanting to tell someone about this for a long time." He told the officer the chronology of events that led to the young woman's death, but the officer considered this version to be questionable. According to Little, on New Year's Eve, he noticed Rachel on the street. He approached and spoke to her, inviting her to his apartment, and the young woman agreed, and they went to his place. There they drank a little, after which a quarrel broke out between them. Little did not specify the reason, but only said that he left for another room. Returning to the kitchen, he saw that Rachel was standing with her back to him. The man approached her and noticed that the young woman was holding a knife in her hand, and the next second, she turned to him and cut his hand. Little panicked, grabbed a kitchen knife, and struck her, which resulted in Rachel's death. The police doubted the truthfulness of this story as it sounded quite illogical. However, they recorded Little's confession and soon took him to the station. During questioning, he confirmed everything he had told the officer and insisted that he acted in self-defense. When asked why he didn't call the police in that case, Little stated that he was scared and thought that no one would believe him, so he decided to hide the body in his closet. Studying his biography, the police learned that Little had an impressive criminal history. From an early age, he was caught stealing and committing other minor offenses. He was expelled from school several times, as a result of which he did not even receive a basic education. The man practically did not work, stayed at home, used alcohol and drugs. The police talked to several of his friends who said that Little often fantasized about meeting different women. Once he even told them that he was dating a beautiful blonde who was 180 centimeters tall, although his friends knew perfectly well that he was not in a relationship with anyone. This detail seemed interesting to the detectives. Rachel had approximately the same height and light hair. They assumed that Little fantasized about a young woman of this type and could choose Rachel as his victim based on these parameters. At the same time, the police established that the young woman was not acquainted with Little, although they lived on neighboring streets. The investigators attempted to reconstruct the timeline of that night and found out that on the evening of December 31st, the suspect met with his friends to prepare for New Year's Eve. But Little left their company. He became angry when the young woman he was trying to flirt with left with his friend. Little then went to another party, but shortly after midnight, he said he was going home. The route from the party location followed the same road that Rachel was walking on. Combining all the available facts, the detectives came to a disturbing conclusion. Remember that stranger who passed Rachel and her mother when she was trying to persuade her daughter not to walk home and even thought about asking that man to accompany Rachel? According to the police, that person was Little. This version was indirectly confirmed by surveillance camera footage. Detectives reviewed the recordings where Rachel was first recorded. About 3 minutes before that moment, a man who looked like Little walked along the same road. But on the second recording, everything changed. When Rachel was captured by another camera, an unknown man was already walking behind her. If it was Little, he would have had to stop somewhere and wait for the young woman to pass, after which he began to pursue her. This version of events contradicted the man's own account, but even more contradictions arose after medical experts presented their reports. On the victim's body, they found 27 stab wounds inflicted with tremendous force, and Rachel had no defensive wounds, despite Little's claim of struggling with her. In addition, some of the blows were delivered to the young woman's back, and as for the suspect himself, no cuts were found on his hands. All these facts unequivocally indicated that his story did not match reality. Based on all the available data, the detectives arrived at a more plausible version. That night, Little was angry because he was rejected at the first party. As he passed by Rachel's mother's house, he overheard part of their conversation and understood that Rachel was going home alone. Rachel also fit the type of woman that Little fantasized about, and he decided to either attack her or try to talk to her. Moving forward, he left the main road and waited for Rachel to pass by, then began to follow her. The situation could have developed in two scenarios. Either he immediately attacked her or tried to flirt with her. In the second case, Rachel would likely have ignored him and walked away. Firstly, she had a boyfriend. Secondly, she wouldn't have gone to the home of a stranger who approached her on the street in the middle of the night. And thirdly, Rachel was very concerned about her kittens. When she found out that her boyfriend had left them all night, she couldn't think of anything else and tried to get home as quickly as possible. It was much more likely that he attacked the young woman when she was as close to his house as possible and dragged her into his apartment. Soon, the forensic experts found evidence of this. There were traces of dirt on the back of Rachel's legs, indicating that she had been dragged on the ground. Forensic experts also established that the young woman was not killed in the kitchen, but in the hallway. That's where most of the bloodstains were found, which the perpetrator tried to wash off. In connection with this, the police suggested that Little killed her immediately after they were in the apartment. Nevertheless, the medical experts found that the victim had been subjected to violence, and Little's DNA was found on her body. Given the alleged chronology of events, by that time, Rachel could already be dead. Based on all of this, on January 31st, Little was charged with murder. However, by that time, Little had already hired a lawyer and decided to retract his initial statement, claiming that he did not kill anyone. In the end, the case was taken to court, and the trial began in October, where Little's lawyers presented a new version of events. Now the man claimed that the real killer was his friend, Mark Fuller, the same person who was arrested with him on the day the body was discovered, but later released as no evidence linked him to the crime. Little claimed that he returned to the house closer to morning and saw his friend and Rachel there. Mark told him that they had met the young woman and decided to go to Little's apartment since Mark had the keys. They all drank together, after which Rachel went with Little to the bedroom and had intimate contact with him. Soon after that, a furious Mark burst into the room. He had feelings for the young woman and went into a rage upon learning about their relationship. He grabbed a knife and inflicted numerous blows on Rachel, then threatened Little. He demanded that Little help him clean up the blood and never tell anyone about what had happened. Otherwise, he threatened to kill not only him, but also his loved ones. As you can guess, nobody believed this story. It contradicted not only the evidence, but also common sense. Everything pointed to Little being the killer, and there was not a single piece of evidence implicating his friend. The trial ended quickly because the defense was unable to present any evidence refuting their client's guilt. As a result, Little was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 25 years, meaning he could be released at the age of 58 if his request is approved. Rachel's murder was a strong blow to all of her relatives, but her older sister suffered the most. The young woman had diabetes, and the illness had a significant impact on her health in the wake of the stress she endured. After a prolonged struggle, she passed away in 2010, and her family blames Little for everything. So this criminal's actions led to 2 deaths. Donna Brown was born on November 10, 1963 in Miami. She grew up in a large and friendly family with 2 younger sisters whom she got along with very well. When Donna was young, her parents divorced and she remained living with her mother. Despite this, her father remained actively involved in his daughters' lives and they remained quite close. After finishing school, Donna received medical training and became a surgical assistant at a local hospital. Her colleagues quickly grew to love her because she took her work seriously and was also a kind and open person. Her life was going quite well, but Donna wanted to start her own family for complete happiness. In the late 1980s, Donna went on a date with a man named Mark Winger, and she almost immediately knew she had met her match. Mark was charming and intelligent, worked as a nuclear engineer, and dreamed of having a large family. They began dating and decided to get married in 1989. Shortly after that, Mark received a job offer at a nuclear facility in Springfield, Illinois. It was a big step up the career ladder for him, and he and Donna decided to move there. The couple settled in a nice neighborhood, and soon after the move, Donna got a job at a local hospital. They only lacked children for complete happiness, but all their attempts were unsuccessful. At some point, Donna learned that she was medically unable to conceive, and it was a devastating blow for her. Both she and Mark dreamed of a large family, and all the conditions of their lives were favorable for it, but fate decided otherwise. Then the couple began to consider adoption, but kept postponing this serious step. This continued until 1995, when everything changed in one day. A pregnant underage girl was admitted to the hospital where Donna worked, and she wanted to give her child to a loving family. Mark and Donna immediately decided to adopt the baby. In June, right after the birth, they adopted a girl and named her Bailey Elizabeth Winger. The day they took her home coincided with the anniversary of their engagement. The couple and all the relatives were happy that they finally had a child. In August of the same year, Donna went to Florida with her 3-month-old daughter to visit her parents and introduce them to their granddaughter. The family had a great time, and sometime later, the woman returned home. She flew to the nearest airport, which was 2 hours away from Springfield, and then hired a taxi to her city through a special company. This trip greatly spoiled Donna's mood because the driver behaved quite inadequately. The whole way he talked about how several personalities lived in him, and they forced him to do various terrible things, such as killing people. In addition, the driver talked about how he regularly participated in orgies and even invited Donna to participate in them. The man also constantly violated traffic rules and drove the car quite dangerously. When Donna got home, she told her husband about it, and he was furious. Mark called the company the driver worked for and demanded that he be fired. It turned out that the driver was 27-year-old Roger Harrington, and after the complaint, the management decided to suspend him from work. But that wasn't the end of it. During the next week, an unknown man called Winger's home phone, refused to identify himself, and asked for Donna. She and her husband suspected that the caller was Roger, and she was seriously concerned about her safety. Given that the man knew their home address, she was afraid that Roger might harm her. On August 29th, a distress call was made to the Springfield Police Department. Mark Winger was in a panic and reported that an unknown man had broken into their home and attacked Donna with a hammer. Mark, shocked and terrified, took his gun and shot the intruder. When the officers arrived at the scene, they found 2 bodies on the floor with Mark in a state of panic. The police officers detected a faint pulse from both individuals on the floor and called an ambulance while trying to obtain information from Mark about what had happened. Although Mark could barely speak, the detectives managed to piece together a rough idea of what had occurred. Mark explained that he was using the treadmill in the basement when he heard a noise upstairs. He went upstairs to the main floor and found his 3-month-old daughter unattended on the bed. When he went to another room, he saw an unknown man attacking his wife with a hammer. Mark panicked and grabbed his gun, shooting the attacker before calling the police. While waiting for the ambulance, one of the officers found a wallet in the attacker's jacket with documents belonging to a Roger Harrington. The detective knew this person well. Roger lived in a trailer park in Springfield and had a criminal history mostly related to minor offenses. He also had mental health issues and was generally known to be quite aggressive. Both Roger and Donna were taken to the hospital, where they died without regaining consciousness. Meanwhile, the police examined the crime scene, collecting evidence. Next to the bodies was a bloodied hammer, while Mark's gun was found on a table nearby, along with a pack of cigarettes and a paper cup of coffee. Mark told the detectives that the cigarettes and coffee were likely brought by the killer. The hammer was from his tool set, as he was planning to hang some pictures that day, so he prepared it and left it in the living room. Near the Wingers' home Roger's car was found, and detectives discovered a note inside. It contained Donna's home address, Mark's name, and the time, 4:30 p.m. When asked if he knew the attacker, Mark initially denied it, but when the police mentioned Roger's name, Mark realized with horror that the driver was the same person. He told the detectives the story of how they knew Roger, his strange behavior towards Donna, and the creepy calls to their home number. The investigators spoke with acquaintances and relatives of Donna who were aware of her fears. She had repeatedly complained to them that she was seriously concerned about Roger and was afraid that he might come to her house one day and seek revenge because he lost his job after she complained to their superiors. Donna even wrote down all the details of her trip with Roger on a piece of paper in case she had to go to the police. The police found this paper at their house, and the investigation lasted for 2 days before the case was closed. No charges were brought against Mark for shooting Roger because his actions were classified as self-defense. He continued to be in a state of shock, and his relatives flew to Springfield to support him and help take care of his daughter. Donna's relatives also provided him with all kinds of assistance. Months went by, and Mark continued to struggle with the loss of his wife, and his family began to notice negative changes in his behavior. He began drinking heavily, although he had never consumed alcohol before these events. He also often visited local bars. His relatives tried to support him in every way possible and help take care of Bailey, but ultimately they had to return to their own cities. Donna's parents understood that it would be difficult for Mark to take care of his daughter, so they suggested finding a nanny. In the end, Mark hired a woman named Rebecca Handed, who specialized in round-the-clock childcare, so she spent most of her time at their house. Rebecca took care of the girl and got along great with her. Mark gradually began to recover, stopped drinking, and returned to work. This went on for several months, and during this time, a romance developed between him and Rebecca. She hardly ever left his house, and they spent time together with Bailey, constantly communicating, and eventually, this led to mutual sympathy. Rebecca also sincerely loved the girl, and a strong bond was formed between them. In 1996, a woman became pregnant, and Mark was given another chance to start a big and strong family. Rebecca also wanted this, and the couple got married in October. Mark and Donna's relatives were surprised that he started a new relationship just a few months after his wife's death, but ultimately supported him, as the new family was beneficial not only to him, but also to Bailey. All the relatives sympathized with Rebecca, seeing her sincere love and care for the girl. Mark decided to sell his house because it constantly reminded him of Donna's death, and after what had happened, he did not want to raise children there. He and Rebecca decided to buy a house with a large plot of land outside the city, renovated it, and started to build their new life. Soon they had a daughter, and over the next few years, they had another daughter and a son. Thus, Mark and Rebecca raised 4 children, and the man's dream of a large family came true. Over time, Mark became more distant from Donna's relatives, who tried to be present in their granddaughter's life. The problem was that Bailey didn't remember Donna at all and considered Rebecca her mother. Mark didn't want the girl to know about the tragic past of their family from an early age, and ultimately, he forbade Donna's parents from calling her their granddaughter. They tried to persuade him, but in the end, they gave up all attempts. The relatives understood that it might be better for the girl to grow up away from what had happened. In the following years, Mark and Rebecca happily lived in their new home, raised their children, and made plans for the future. The tragedy of the past gradually faded, but its echoes continued to haunt the family. In 1999, Mark decided to sue the company that hired Roger Harrington as a driver. In Mark's opinion, this company did not make any effort to check this person's sanity, and as a result, it led to the murder of his wife. The company did not want to admit its guilt, and Mark hired a lawyer. To determine their guilt, the court decided to study all the materials of the case and the evidence, which were handed over to the lawyers. While they were preparing for the trial, something completely unexpected happened. In February of the same year, a woman named Deanne Schultz came to the police and told detectives a shocking story. Deanne was Donna's best friend and worked with her at the hospital. When Donna had a child, Deanne actively helped her take care of the girl. But Deanne's story turned everything upside down. She confessed to the police that she had been having an affair with Mark for several months, which they had kept hidden from their spouses. It all started 3 months before Donna's death. Around the same time, the couple adopted a daughter. Mark and Deanne were secretly seeing each other, but this was just the tip of the iceberg. The woman told detectives that Mark wanted to get rid of his wife to be with her. One day he said it would be so much easier if Donna just died. He then began to persuade Deanne to help him with a plan, but he did not reveal the details. Mark said that all Deanne needed to do was go to their house, find his wife's body, and call the police. The woman thought Mark couldn't be serious and was just joking, but he continued to share troubling things with her. After Donna complained to him about Roger Harrington's behavior, he told Deanne about it and said he had planned to frame the driver. He added that he just needed to figure out how to lure him into the house. A week before the murder, he called Deanne and asked if she would still love him no matter what, to which she answered, yes. A few days after Donna's murder, friends and family gathered at their house to support Mark. When he was alone with Deanne, he said, "It seems like the police believe me. I did it for us." The woman was shocked, but Mark demanded that she not tell anyone, and she obeyed. They continued to secretly see each other and even exchanged rings, planning to get married in the foreseeable future. But in the following months, Mark started a romantic relationship with the nanny and eventually broke up with Deanne. She was devastated. She had kept this terrible secret from Mark, and he had traded her for someone else. Deanne never dared to tell the police about everything, realizing that part of the blame was on her. Over the next few years, the woman repeatedly tried to take her own life, and only after 3.5 years did she finally overcome herself and go to the police station. The detectives were completely shocked. All this time, Mark had been considered a victim and even a hero who tried to save his beloved wife from a terrible killer. But Deanne's story changed everything, and the police looked at the case from a completely different angle. The investigators decided to re-examine the evidence, but they were met with an unpleasant surprise. All of it had been handed over to lawyers who were preparing Mark's case against the transportation company. It would take time to retrieve them, but some materials from the case remained at the station. The photographs from the crime scene. The lead detective looked at them and realized with horror that they had missed some obvious things all these years. The investigation had been quickly closed after the murder, as no one doubted Roger's guilt. But now, as the detective held these photos for the first time, he realized that the positioning of the bodies did not match Mark's story at all. He had told them that when he entered the room, Donna was lying on the floor and the perpetrator was striking her with a hammer from above, and then he shot him and Roger fell next to the woman. In reality, however, his body was lying in the opposite direction, and he physically could not have fallen in that direction. The detective realized that Mark's story was a lie, and it made him rethink a whole series of moments that now made much more sense. First of all, no one ever figured out how Roger got into the house. There were no signs of a break-in, and Donna certainly would not have opened the door for him, But if you remember the note inside Roger's car, everything falls into place. It had Mark's name and the time, which looked like a reminder of a meeting. Remembering Deanne's story, detective concluded that Mark had somehow invited Roger to their home on some pretext and let him in, after which he shot him. Secondly, in Roger's car, they found a knife and several other items that he could have used for the murder, but he did not take them with him and used Mark's hammer, which the man took out of the closet on that very day and left in plain sight. All of this sounded completely illogical if you assume that Roger came to the house to kill someone. Moreover, he left a pack of cigarettes and a paper cup of coffee on their table, a very strange thing for a person who came there to kill. The detective listened to the recording of the 911 call made by Mark and was once again shocked. Mark told the operator that he had shot the attacker once, after which there was a male mumble in the background as if someone was trying to speak. Mark told the operator that his daughter was crying and he needed to go to her, after which he hung up. However, there was no hint of a child's crying on the recording. A more realistic scenario was that Mark did not shoot Roger once, and on hearing the gunshot, Donna ran to him and her husband hit her with a hammer. After that, he called the police and pretended to be panicked, reporting what had happened. Suddenly, Roger woke up and tried to say something, and those sounds were recorded on the call. Mark lied about his daughter crying, hung up, and shot Roger again. In support of this version, there was another fact that the investigators completely ignored. Mark and Donna's neighbors said during the questioning that they heard 2 shots. However, about 5 minutes had passed between them, which did not fit with Mark's story, but completely matched the more realistic version in which he was the killer. But that wasn't all. During the initial investigation, which lasted only 2 days, the experts did not even examine the evidence. However, now that Mark decided to sue the transportation company, they hired lawyers and were going to win this case. The lawyers requested an independent examination of the clothing of all 3 participants in those events. The results spoke for itself. Blood spatters and traces indicated that Mark's story had nothing to do with reality. According to him, Roger was hitting Donna with a hammer, but there was not a drop of her blood on his clothes, not even the smallest, while there was plenty of blood from his wife on Mark's clothes, which directly indicated that he had killed his wife. The police took the evidence from the lawyers and conducted their own analysis, which showed exactly the same result. In the end, the police reopened the investigation, but this time it was about a double murder in which Mark became a suspect. His family was in shock. No one believed that the man was capable of such a brutal crime. Donna's relatives were skeptical of the suspicions against Mark until they heard all the information that the detectives had uncovered. The only ones who insisted on Roger's innocence from the first day were his friends and family members. They were all aware of his minor criminal history, but did not believe he was capable of murder. Moreover, their neighbor Roger, with whom they shared a rental, initially gave the police important information that they overlooked. Immediately after the murder, the detectives questioned the man, and he told them that the day before, Roger received a call, hung up, and wrote down Mark Winger's name, address, and time on a piece of paper. It all looked as if Mark had scheduled a meeting with him, but the police did not attach much importance to it. Rebecca experienced the greatest shock from the whole situation. She knew Mark as a loving and caring father who had never shown any aggression during their time together. She refused to believe that this person could beat his wife with a hammer and frame someone else. After several weeks of investigation, the police decided to arrest Mark, and he was arrested right at work. The case was sent to court. Mark was granted a $1 million bail. He could not raise that amount, so he remained in custody awaiting trial. The trial did not begin until 3 years later, in May 2002. All his close ones and even Donna's relatives hoped that this would be a big misunderstanding and that the court would prove Mark's innocence. None of them were prepared for the opposite, and his lawyers insisted on the truthfulness of Mark's version. They noted that the crime scene photos could have been taken after the medics moved Roger's body, considering that the doctor's actions were not documented. It was possible to prove or disprove this possibility. In addition, the lawyers emphasized Roger's criminal history, his mental problems, and his inappropriate behavior with Donna during the trip. Deanne Schultz became the main witness in this case. By law, she could have been punished for keeping Mark's secret all these years, but the judge decided to grant her full immunity in exchange for her testimony. The male lawyers tried to discredit Deanne in every possible way, pointing out that she had attempted suicide multiple times, which could indicate psychological problems. The defense also suggested that she had made it all out of jealousy, seeking revenge on Mark. The prosecution insisted that the evidence and Deanne's testimony unequivocally pointed to his guilt. As for motive, it lay in the mistress's story. Mark lost interest in Donna long before they adopted Bailey. He'd been having secret affairs with her best friend, but he could not divorce Donna because he would have to split their expensive home and other assets, which was unacceptable to him. After Roger gave Donna a ride from the airport, Mark saw the perfect opportunity and decided to act. As terrible as it sounds, Mark was lucky. He encountered a man with a criminal record and mental illness who claimed to hear voices telling him to kill people. After Roger complained to management, he lost his job, which became the perfect motive when both the prosecution and defense laid their cards on the table, leaving only the jury's decision to wait for. Despite the compelling evidence against Mark, there were still doubts about his guilt among both his family members and Donna's relatives. None of them could imagine a loving father and respected member of society as a killer. Nevertheless, the jury unanimously found him guilty of the double murder. In the end, Mark received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, and Roger was posthumously exonerated. Rebecca could not believe that her husband had actually killed Donna. It took her a long time to impartially consider all the evidence of his guilt until she finally came to terms with the fact that he was truly a murderer. The chief detectives apologized repeatedly to Donna's and Roger's families for the sloppy initial investigation. He admitted his guilt in accepting the most logical version of events as the only correct one, overlooking all the contradictions. If you think that's the end of the story, then I have another unexpected turn for you. Even after the conviction, many doubted whether Mark had actually done it. But in 2006, those doubts were dispelled. In Mark's prison cell, they found 19 pages of handwritten text in which he was plotting to kill Deanne and another person. Mark wanted to hire a hitman straight from prison through other inmates or people on the outside. His desire to kill Deanne was understandable. He wanted to avenge the woman for revealing all his secrets to the police. The second person on the list was a man named Jeffrey Gelman, his childhood friend. Detectives quickly discovered the reason for such a decision. Mark asked him for $1 million bail, but the friend refused to provide such a sum. From these handwritten pages, it followed that Mark wanted to kidnap the man to get a solid ransom for him and then kill him. Why he needed money for life imprisonment was unclear. Perhaps he planned to eventually get out or escape. But in the end, the man faced another trial and received an additional 35 years in prison for planning a double murder. After that, no one doubted that Mark was the one who killed Donna. Rebecca raised 4 children alone, and they all know what kind of monster their father is. They changed their last names and do not plan to communicate with Mark. In 2019, Rebecca decided that Bailey should renew contact with Donna's relatives who had not seen her since she was 3 years old. Bailey was already 24 at the time, and she went to Florida and had a great time with them. They still communicate, and the young woman learns more about Donna from them. As for Mark, he is still in prison and denies his guilt. Perhaps he would never have been held accountable for what he did if it weren't for 2 factors that happened almost simultaneously. The first is the testimony of his former mistress. She could no longer keep this secret, especially watching how the killer creates a new family and raises children. The second factor is Mark's greed. Almost 4 years after the murder, he decided to sue his employer, Roger Harrington, for a substantial sum, even though he was earning very good money himself. Apparently, he did not expect third-party experts to study the evidence much more carefully than the local detectives. Interestingly, the M decided to turn to the police, including after learning about this lawsuit. It became one of the last straws, and the woman revealed Mark's terrible secret.